We're going to call this meeting to order, and as we get started today, Commissioners, we have a very long agenda, but before we get started, to make it just a little bit longer, we're going to do a couple presentations. So, I am going to go up here, and I'm going to, for this first one, I'm going to ask our Parks Director to join me as we honor one of our amazing staff members here at the city. So I'm going to come up here, and I'll invite David to join me as we honor Mr. Joe Sulak.
Okay, great. Good morning, City Manager, Mayor, and Commissioners. David Marquardt, Director of Parks and Recreation. Pleased to be here. Thank you for allowing us a little bit of time this morning. We just wanted to give a quick recognition of Joe Sulak today. Joe is our Parks Superintendent. He recently received his CITES Accredited Professional Certification. CITES certification, if you're not aware of that, is very similar to LEED certification, but it has everything to do with sustainability in the outside world. Everything pertaining to our parks world. So as we kick off the spring season and a new strategic direction with the city that you're going to be hearing more about this morning, and we think more about comprehensive stewardship in our park system, this new certification is in direct alignment with many of our new initiatives here in the city. So we're very pleased to have Joe with that certification, and wanted to bring him in front of you to congratulate him today together. So Mayor Bliss.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll let Joe say a few words, but I'm going to add my thanks and congratulations to Joe on behalf of our entire City Commission. I know every single one of us up here have worked with Joe on a number of issues over the years, and we appreciate your work and dedication and your leadership.
Thank you.
So do you want to say a few words, Joe?
Oh, sure. Well, thank you. Good morning, Commissioners. It's an honor to be recognized, and I really appreciate the opportunity from the city to acquire this accreditation. And I think it's going to be great as we move forward. We actually have a couple projects that could qualify. We're going to be doing a restoration planting at Fair Plains Cemetery on the west side there, where we're going to restore native grassland there on the west side of that. And then also in Plaster Creek Park redevelopment there, we're looking at probably getting some site certification for that as well. So again, I really appreciate the opportunity. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And Steve wants a picture.
No,
Oh, you won't? Okay, all right. All right, so next, I'm going to take a moment as well to recognize another one of our really awesome city employees and appointed officials, and that is our city clerk. So I'm going to ask our city clerk to come down here for two things. I have a proclamation as we prepare for Municipal Clerks Week, and then I want to let everyone know about a recent designation that our city clerk has earned. So I'll start with the proclamation, and I'll hand this over to our city clerk. So whereas the office of the municipal clerk, a time-honored and vital part of local government, exists throughout the world, and whereas the office of the municipal clerk is the oldest among public servants, whereas the office of the municipal clerk provides the professional link between the citizens, the local governing bodies, and agencies of government at all levels, and whereas municipal clerks have pledged to be ever mindful of their neutrality and impartiality, rendering equal service to all, whereas the municipal clerk serves as the information center on functions of local government and community, whereas municipal clerks continually strive to improve the administration of the affairs of the office of the clerk through participation in education programs, seminar, workshops, and annual meetings at the state, county, and international level. And whereas it is most appropriate that we recognize the accomplishments of all clerks. Now therefore I, Rosalind Bliss, Mayor of Grand Rapids, do hereby proclaim May 5th through the 11th as Municipal Clerks Week. And I invite everyone to come together and honor and celebrate that with us. And so today, in addition to giving this proclamation to our city clerk, I want to recognize him because Mr. Joel Hondorp, our city clerk, was recently designated a Master Municipal Clerk, and this was awarded by the International Institute of Municipal Clerks. That's a mouthful.
It is.
You're welcome. You want to say a few words?
I know it's a long meeting. No.
It is a long meeting, but you should say a few words. You worked hard for that designation.
So I thank the commission. As I said in my interview a year ago, so we're almost on that 1-year anniversary. It has been a pleasure to serve you and serve the resident city of Grand Rapids. And as I said way back then, that I'm a firm believer in lifelong education and striving that in our staff as well to get these designations. And also I'll be going down to Birmingham in May for the conference, and they've asked me to present there as well. So not only giving to here, but to the profession as well. So thank you.
Congratulations.
Thanks.
Well, thank you all for participating in that with us. And now I will turn to our first item on the agenda, and that is a resolution to adopt the City of Grand Rapids Preliminary Strategic Plan. Can I get a motion?
Support.
All right, so Commissioners, we've all worked on this with city staff for several months, and all of you have the big 3-ring binder with our strategic plan in it. I assure the community it's not that big. I hope you take some time to read it. So I'll turn it over to Allison before I call the question. So go ahead.
Thank you. Good morning, Mayor, Commissioners, City Manager, and staff. Very excited to be here today to request your approval of the City of Grand Rapids Strategic Plan for fiscal years 20 through 23. I know this has been a journey that you have been on with us, and really just want to take a few moments this morning to highlight a couple of additions that you'll see in the printed version of the plan that you have available, and that is available online for our community as well, and then really take some time to acknowledge the contributors and the team that has supported the creation of the plan. And so with that, I just want to jump in. I'm not going to go through in detail anything in the plan. You've participated via a number of workshops and providing some fantastic feedback, but I'm going to kind of quickly just scroll through on the screen some of the visuals because I think it's really fantastic. And I'm sure if you've had the chance to look through it, you will see that we've had some additions. Our city manager has included a letter to open and really state his vision for the strategic plan. We did include kind of a current state and highlighting the city of Grand Rapids. There were, I know, a couple of errors on this originally, so we updated those, and in your printed copy, those have been corrected as well as the version online. Just some high-level statistics for our current state of affairs in the city. Some nice recognition that the city has received and wanting to highlight just a few of the programs that we're participating on a national level. And then you all are familiar with the planning process, so I won't go into that. I really just wanted to reiterate for those that may be hearing about the plan for the first time, it's a 4-year plan, and this is the operational plan for the City of Grand Rapids that will be driving business via the city manager. And it really is the link between our long-term master plan and our short-term annual fiscal plan that I know the city manager will be working with you soon. So with that, again, not going to go into this, just going to show you and highlight. We've, through our team, done a great job with the visualization around our values, the vision statement that was created by commission, as well as the mission. And then those highlighting kind of here in the beginning of the plan, the summary of our 6 strategic priorities that we've included in the plan. So governmental excellence, economic prosperity and affordability, engaged and connected community, health and environment, safe community and mobility. So with that, I think the only other thing before kind of transitioning into acknowledging our contributors is I did want to highlight the staff has worked really hard to include as many metrics as we possibly could in the plan. And so the baseline that's been identified is calendar year 2018 unless otherwise noted. And for all of the areas where metrics are available, we have been able to include 81% of all those metrics. So we are still working on a few of them. But in some of the other areas where we say we're going to complete a survey, that of course hasn't been completed yet, so that's not a baseline metric that we have as of this time. And then with the goal, a note around that, we will be working here. There are some goals that are included, but we have more work to be done, around creating the goals. And so that's something that we'll be working on here in the next year. But the intention is really that the goals are those that can be completed within the 4-year time period of the plan unless otherwise noted. So with that, I'm going to move all the way down to the very end. We did include one page is a brief overview of some items for implementation. Of course, the creation of this plan has been a big process in it of itself, but implementation is really what we need to do as the next step to ensure that this plan is successful and comes to life and is really driving city operations. And so you'll be hearing more about implementation as we report out and as staff comes together to work around embedding accountability with respect to the strategic plan. So with that, I'm going to acknowledge some contributors and then turn it over to you to ask if you have any questions or comments that you would like to make with respect to the plan. But I did want to take a minute, as I said, it is a pretty lengthy team, but I think it's important. We've invited them to be here today. They've been significant contributors to the plan, and so I would like to acknowledge them. And first, I would like to start by acknowledging our city manager, Washington. He's really been the leader behind our strategic plan, came to the city with a vision of organizing our work and being focused and thoughtful about where we are focusing, and so really appreciate his leadership and his vision in terms of helping to get this plan off of the ground. And also want to thank all of you as commission. I know you've dedicated a good chunk of time to participating in the workshops and to providing your feedback and guidance, really to help establish a framework for this strategic plan, and really look forward to continuing to work with you as we implement it. We do have our outside consultant, Scott Patton, is here today. If you wouldn't mind standing, please, Scott, for a minute. He is from Plant Moran, and he has been here with us since the beginning. I know you're aware, but he came in back in November and really helped us create a framework for working through the strategic plan, and of course helped facilitate our early commission session. So thank you very much, Scott. Really appreciate your help and your time. So our executive strategy team, I'm just going to ask them, I'll say their names if they wouldn't mind standing so that we can acknowledge them, and then if we want to give them some applause, we could wait until the end. In addition to city manager and myself, Mr. Eric DeLong, Mr. Jeff Dode, Ms. Desiree Foster, Ms. Becky Jo Glover, Mr. John Globinski, Chief John Lehman. And so the executive team, stand up, I know you're here, for those that are here. This team really led from an executive level in providing guidance and ensuring that we were really on the right track for working on the plan, so thank you. Okay, and then next I just want to take a minute. We have a number of our outcome team members that are here today, and so I'm going to quickly go through each of the areas and highlight. We had a project team, and those members were responsible for leading the outcome teams, developing the content of the plan for each of the strategic priority areas. We also had an equity champion to make sure that we were really embedding equity in our work. But the project team, they really were, I call them the workhorses. They were the ones that put in a significant amount of time to really help develop the metrics and the strategies, to be thoughtful about ensuring the values were being embedded across the plan, as well as making sure that the entire plan was working together. So I'm going to read through these quickly, and we'll ask the team members as I say your name to stand up. So for governmental excellence, Mr. Luke Canfield was our project team lead. Our equity champion was Ms. Patty Cottle. And other plan members, Mr. Jose Capellas, Ms. Laura Claypool, Ms. Molly Eastman, Mr. John Overman, and Mr. Gary Secor. So please stand. I know you're here. Stand, stand, stand. Economic prosperity and affordability was led with our project team members, Ms. Erin Banchoff, Mr. Brandon Davis, and Mr. John O'Closter. Mr. Davis also served as our equity champion, and then Ms. Lynn Heemstra, Mr. AJ Hills, and Ms. Kristen Turkelson served on that team as well. So. Engaged and Connected Community was led by Ms. Alex Melton and Ms. Stacy Stout. Ms. Stout also served as our equity champion for this team, and other team members were Ms. Layla Islani, Mr. Asante Kane, Ms. Yvette Pittman, and Ms. Amy Snowbuckner. Health and Environment, I was the project team lead for that, and Ms. Shara Ponsel was our equity champion, and the other team members were Ms. Karen Ferret, Mr. Mike Grenier, Mr. David Marquardt, and Ms. Nicole Posh. Two more. For mobility, led by our very own Mr. Josh Naramore, and our equity champion was Mix Hank Kelly. Other team members were Mr. Rick DeVries, Mr. Gary Reamer, and Mr. Juan Torres. And our last strategic priority was safe community. And our project team members there were our Assistant Fire Chief, Brad Brown, and our Police Captain, Jeff Collard. And then from our Police Department, Sergeant Dan Adams served as our Equity Champion. Other team members included Ms. Kristen Bennett, Mr. Eric Jordan, Mr. Kevin Santos, and Ms. Joanna Schulte. So we did have some great administrative support. I want to acknowledge this plan can't come to fruition without them, as well as our video team in bringing this all to life. So really, in wrapping up, I just wanted to take one quick moment to really highlight two people that I've already acknowledged, but have been working with me from the beginning, and that really is our Fire Chief, Assistant Fire Chief Brad Brown. If you'd please stand just for a minute. He came on, you all are aware of his expertise in strategic planning and what he has done with the fire station. He came in December when we had a trio that started working on this and said, here's the framework, here's who we need to meet with and when, and the deadlines we have to hit so that we ensure that we can get this plan done on time. And without his partnership and without his support, the plan would not have been completed by today. So a big thanks to Assistant Chief Brad Brown. And then the last person on our trio was, of course, Ms. Alex Melton, if you would please stand. And she truly is the artist and the designer behind the visuals and the plan that you have in front of you today. And a few of us were just talking about, had this just been a Word document, the likelihood that as many people would have been excited about it or been as engaged with it is a lot less than what she has been able to do to really bring this to life, as well as help support for the visuals throughout the entire process. So a big thank you to Ms. Melton for that. An honor serving with the entire team, truly dedicated public servants that have gone above and beyond to help with the plan. So with that, I just wanted to take a minute to ask if you have any questions or comments, or City Manager.
I think I'll turn to our city manager first and then see if anyone has any comments, and then we'll call the question. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mayor. I want to echo my sentiments and appreciation for all the staff and for your leadership who have made this plan possible. But I must pause and recognize the outstanding leadership that we benefit from our strategic plan project manager, Ms. Allison Waskey-Sutter. She has been very diligent and has done an outstanding job, and I am pleased to work with her, not only on this project, but I look forward to the work that she will do for us corporately as she keeps the eye on performance management throughout the organization so that this plan does not rest on the shelf, but really becomes a guidepost for us in making decisions. So thank you, and thank all the city employees for their contribution to making this day possible. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I will add my thanks for everyone that sits around this table. I know when we embarked on this in December and we had this lofty goal of getting it done before the budget, I think some of us were a little concerned about that, but we were able to make it happen. And we know a lot of work went into bringing us to where we are today. So I'll add my thanks to everyone who worked so hard, as well as my thanks to everyone around this table who came together multiple times to get us to our very first strategic plan that we know is going to be the foundation of our upcoming budget. So thank you so much. Commissioners, any other questions or comments?
Good job.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes.
All right, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, it carries. Thank you. All right, next that will take us to a resolution approving a memorandum of understanding for river restoration between Grand Rapids Whitewater and the city of Grand Rapids. Can I get a motion?
So moved.
Support.
All right, I'll turn to Mr. DeLong to tee this up, and I see we have partners here from Grand Rapids Whitewater, so Mr. Heacock, welcome. We'll let Eric get started and
Thank you,
Go
Mayor,
from there.
and members of the commission. I'm here today on behalf of our partnership, Grand Rapids Whitewater. Steve Heacock is here representing them today. And really, this is a story, it's kind of an amazing story of our community, how we had a plan, Green Grand Rapids, it turned into two guys, Chip and Chris, thinking that they could do this, to moving forward, to forming a Grand Rapids Whitewater, to now getting to the point where we actually had a significant permitting meeting yesterday in the community, which was very well attended. So the partnership is growing, it's moving along very well, and what we wanted to do with this MOU is formalize the relationship so that we could move the project forward and everybody would understand their responsibilities to each other and to the community. So that's what the MOU does. It's been reviewed extensively by the Whitewater Board, by our city attorney's office. I've been directly involved in it, and I believe it covers everything that we need to do to accomplish this project together. So it's a partnership document, and really Grand Rapids, Whitewater, and the city are kind of standing up together, representing all the partners that are helping make this project work. So with that, I'd recommend to you consideration of this MOU.
Okay,
Thank you.
great.
And Mr. Heacock is here if we have any questions.
Mr. Heacock, you want to add anything? Of course. Okay. Welcome.
Thank you so much. First of all, I don't get the chance, so I'm going to take it. As a citizen of Grand Rapids, thank you all for your service. It's very difficult work, but certainly incredibly important. And nowhere have I seen it more important than in this project. I'm sitting here looking at your motto, which is Motu Wiget, which stands for strength in activity. And I'm thinking about not only the activity it takes to create a great city and have it maintain momentum once that's created, but then strength and activity of the people of the city and the opportunity to recreate and to be within a great amenity that we have in this town. You'll notice this legal agreement doesn't look like most legal agreements. It's very friendly. It's short. It just talks about what we mean to each other and what we mean to do together. That collaboration has been phenomenal from certainly the mayor's leadership, and leadership can never be underestimated. It's phenomenal how that can move a project along, and we appreciate that leadership. But City Manager Washington and Eric, our partnership's been phenomenal, as well as Jay Steffen and others. So this has moved along very well. There's still much to be done. We're just at the beginning, really. But the private sector that I have the joy of representing, these donors who have stepped forward to join the city of Grand Rapids in creating this phenomenal amenity for the city, recreating, really restoring this phenomenal amenity. It's remarkable. When we go to the federal government and sit with other urban river projects, they all are astounded that the private sector and the public sector has gotten together so closely. And for us, this is what we do. This is in our DNA. So again, let me end by where I began. Thank you so much for your work. Thanks for your interest in this project, and I'd be happy to answer any questions if you have any for me.
Great, thank you. Commissioners, any questions about the MOU? This really solidifies the partnership that we've had for a long time, but especially as we move forward with permitting, this is helpful to really delineate responsibilities and partnership. So, anything? All right, I'll call the question. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? It carries. Thank you. Thanks for being here. And I'll also thank Jay Steffen, who has worked really closely on this project and continues to do so. So thank you. All right, next that will take us to a presentation of study completed by Hillard Heinz. Am I saying that right? Hillard Heinz? For the Grand Rapids Police Department, a strategic review of our department staffing. And to kick this off, I'm going to turn it to our city manager who has led this. Commissioners, I know that we received a copy on Friday, so hopefully you've had a chance to read it. It's a lengthy document, but we'll have a nice overview today. So, city manager?
Thank you, Mayor. Good morning. Thank you, Mayor. I would like to, before we hear from our consultant, I want to, first of all, acknowledge how we got to this point since my arrival. I'll pick up in November of 2018 when Chief Kittle was still with us. If you can
Chief
recall.
Rahinsky.
Excuse me, Chief Rahinsky, that's misspeak, Chief. Chief Rahinsky.
I'm like, he's right there. Chief Kittle's still
He's
here.
like, well, yeah. Well, Chief Rahinsky was still with us. We had just completed an update to this commission on November the 13th regarding the 21st Century Community Policing Task Force. And one of the recommendations in that study was to complete the deployment study. And if you recall, at the conclusion of that briefing where Chief Rahinsky laid out his responses to the recommendations, I likewise provided a timeline in which my intent was to complete the study early this spring. I think I said actually around March, and have that study presented and help to inform budget recommendations as it relates to staffing. There's been several years of discussions and requests about the appropriate staffing level. I think some requests that came from the department, and those requests were delayed until the completion of this study. Well, the study, you approved the contract with Hillard Hines back in November the 27th to award the contract, which is also consistent, might I add, to the recent strategic plan that you just approved in terms of the outcome for safe community. That was one of the objectives in the plan, to complete the deployment study. So I want to thank the department, the police department, for their work in helping us to get to this point. I want to set some expectations for today. Today is not a point of decision. Today is a point of information. We are going to be informed by the analysis, the independent analysis, mind you, of our consultants that we hired. Upon my arrival, I was reminded of previous efforts to look at staffing within the police department, and there were some concerns around the previous independence of the study, I believe, as I recall, from ICMA. And during this entire time, I wanted to make sure that the consultants were able to do their work as independent as possible. And I know that they have been engaging the department, but we were wanting to make sure that you had an opportunity to, we all had an opportunity, community, because community invested in it. There's been much discussion about the cost of the study, and for $100,000, the community has a right to know, as well as we all know, have a right to know what the outcome of this work is. So I want to thank the department for their cooperation in this study. I'll have more remarks at the conclusion. Also, today I'm going to ask Chief Kittle at the conclusion of the report to come and provide any remarks that he might have at this time. But again, today is a point of information, not decision. While we will get the information today, I will be contemplating both short-term things we can do in the interim prior to my April 23rd budget proposal. But long-term, there are some things that are in this study that the chief nor I will be able to, interim Chief Kittle nor I will be able to address, and those will have to be deferred to the police chief that will be soon to be hired. This is an important work, and it's going to inform decisions, but it's not the only point of information, and I'll have more remarks about that at the conclusion of the presentation. At this time, I would like to briefly introduce Deborah Kirby and Dr. Alexander Weiss. Ms. Kirby is the Chief Legal Officer who serves as Project Director for Hillard Hines, and she's done some collaborative reform efforts for them. She's also has a master's degree in Homeland Security from the Naval Postgraduate School and a doctorate of law from the John Marshall School of Law. She was also the highest ranking at the time of her departure from the Chicago Police Department, highest ranking female in that department with expertise in labor management and criminal investigation. Dr. Weiss is here, and he also has 30 years of public administration experience with 9 years of director at Northwestern University for Center for Public Policy, Public Safety, and professor of management at the Kellogg Graduate School of Management. He is current professor of criminal justice at Michigan State University, and he was senior advisor to the Indianapolis Police Department and criminal justice professor at Indiana University, and served 12 years as an officer at the Colorado Springs Police Department. I want to thank them for being here today, and at this time I will yield to Ms. Kirby.
All right. Good morning, everybody. And we usually start with the agenda and the introduction, but the city manager did a fabulous job on it, so our introduction is done. What we're going to cover today are what we call really our key insights. Findings determine some issues, and as the city manager identified, I think the insights are more valuable long-term for this department and for the city. We're also going to go into greater detail around the patrol staffing study based on the data and the analysis that my colleague will present. And then at the end, we're available for questions and discussions as the city council so desires. So a little bit about who Hillard Hines is. We are truly an independent consultant in this review of the Grand Rapids Police Department. We are nationally known as a law enforcement security risk management firm. We provide consulting services around a variety of issues and topics that help inform not only local municipalities, but some of the larger corporations and larger governmental units in our country. What we did here in Grand Rapids is that, as the city manager identified, it was a relatively short time frame. You guys wanted some things done relatively quickly, and we responded. We evaluated a significant amount of data from not only your reporting system, but your CAD system, also in terms of organizational structure, policies, procedures within Grand Rapids. We also did a little bit of benchmarking around the neighborhood, the surrounding surrounding areas in terms of what is policing in Southwest Michigan, although our firm has a good understanding of what that is. But we also looked at some of the national issues that are facing law enforcement and how does that come into context within the goals and the insight of the Grand Rapids Police Department. And we also surveyed the officers within the organization, as well as civilian members, about what were their opinions, their issues, their attitudes towards policing within Grand Rapids. And so what does it mean for this council and for the decisions to be made is that we've come in with some insight that has been developed on not only hard data, but our experience nationally, as well as benchmarking opportunities and really, frankly, engagement with many of you here in the council, some of the civilian representatives of the organization, sworn representatives, and community members that have engaged with the department on a regular basis. What this report does, though, is it places the department squarely within this transition period. You're selecting a new chief as we talk. You're out there interviewing and identifying potential chief candidates, and we see this report as being a roadmap for what that chief may or may not be able to implement coming forward. When we looked at the Grand Rapids Police Department overall, we were met with a high level of professionalism. What we're here talking about is not about the capacity or the ability of the officers within Grand Rapids. We found most, if not all, of the officers that we engaged with to be highly thoughtful about their policing services. They had a focus and a desire to talk about community and serve the community. And we also saw that there was really a focus on delivering and responding to calls for service. When we were hired, we were tasked with looking at some of the efficiency drivers and the alignment of the organization as it relates to sworn and civilian staffing. And honestly, that's where the bulk of our examination occurred, is that what does resourcing within the Grand Rapids Police Department mean, and how is it supported through the decisions of its command staff, the city, and its officers. So one of the key things, and this is not unusual for most law enforcement, is that they really have a focus and a need for strategic operational vision within Grand Rapids. And that means that right now, for a variety of reasons, within the Grand Rapids Police Department, it is very much workload focused. Calls come in for service, officers are responding. And that's what most law enforcement agencies do. But the challenge is that demands are becoming more complex, and they're also becoming a little bit challenging in terms of a single officer response. And so being able to identify strategies to help advance, one, only visibility, the ability to respond to calls for service, and ensuring that the appropriate connectivity is made between the demand or call for service and what an officer can provide to that resident on the other end of the call. What we think and what we observed is that a lot of the focus within this organization is really, in some regards, demand-driven, and the officers are responding to that. If they're able to identify through a strategic focus what it is exactly we want officers to do in Grand Rapids and measure that focus, you'll see a much more efficient response in terms of policing. Another key issue that we saw within Grand Rapids, and we were asked to look at basically civilian alignment with organizational goals, as well as making recommendations around position staffing. On the operational side of the department, there's essentially no civilian support for this organization. You have 2 full-time civilian equivalents, and then you have 30 part-time cadets, which provide a great service, but they are part-time civilian employees to the organization and used in a way that is not necessarily strategic, but really depending upon the schedules of those individuals and where the organization can best utilize them. What this means, and understand that Grand Rapids Police Department is not inconsistent with many organizations, particularly within the Midwest, is that as budgets became tight over the last decade and a half, you started seeing more civilian staff being attrited out of an organization, and law enforcement officers were retained. But when that civilian staff went away, it didn't mean that the work went away. And so now you have law enforcement officers engaging a significant amount of administrative work, which would be, frankly, more efficient and effective serviced by people who are trained to do such work. What we also saw is that your detective division is significantly impacted by this, because you have detectives engaging in a lot of work that, frankly, a less skilled civilian support staff member could do, and then allow your detectives to continue to focus really on high-level investigations. What it also means is that there's no pressure valve release, and so as calls for service come in, there is not a, for lack of a better term, a sifting opportunity within your dispatch system to, peel off calls. Do I send a parking aide to that complaint about parking, or do I send a sworn police officer to that complaint about parking? And that's not to say that the department isn't using civilian staff. There's really good practice in terms of the communication system and then also with the forensics. It's fully staffed by civilians. That's a good practice. It's recognized nationally. But when you look at your day-to-day operations, you have a limited use of civilian staff there. Sorry, I'm having problems with the... And this kind of gets to the overarching issue that we're looking at. We were not tasked with looking at dispatch, and so our review is somewhat removed from that. We're looking at the end user result of dispatch policies and practices. And most of your calls for service are dispatched, even if police service is of limited value. And so if somebody calls in and wants a police officer, you're sending a police officer. And that goes with the ethos of having a high service law enforcement organization and able to respond to a citizen or resident call for service. The challenge with that is that there's not a lot of clarity as to what are those specific calls and how are they being assigned. You have large groupings of categories. One of the CAD categories is suspicious person, noise, or event. That covers a lot of things, and to be able to provide analysis subsequent to that to identify, am I using the right resources for the calls for service that I'm getting, doesn't necessarily occur within the department because the use of data is somewhat limited. Many agencies are looking at alternative methods for handling calls for service. That is something that is not being done fully within Grand Rapids, although you do have a pilot on some automated police calls, and you're allowing residents to call in to report certain types of events. And so many agencies nationally are looking at value out of that because it keeps police officers visible on the street, allows them to provide that assurity to the community, and also allows them to intervene in those events where they are able to be effective. The other issue that is a efficiency matter for the department is that most dispatch assignments result in a report. And so that means that Grand Rapids police officers spend a lot of time documenting what they do at every call for service, even if there's not a relevant criminal follow-on from that report. And so you're generating a lot of information, a lot of reports in a system. And as my colleague will talk, you spend a lot of times on your calls. And so that begins to cascade in terms of event and effect on visibility and availability of officers. When we talk about investigations, one of the things that we believe the department would strongly benefit from is a better case management system to identify the input of a case from the beginning to its outcome. Right now, those procedures, while documented in some policies, are not so specifically rigorous in terms of what are those statuses and how are cases assigned and why they are assigned. And so what we're seeing with the department is that as an increase in certain types of cases come in, frankly, from a perspective of volume, decisions are being made to assign them to less of a rigorous follow-up investigation, and yet those statuses are not always consistent in terms of how they're identified. And this is consistent with policing practice nationally as well, is that you have a limited number of resources, let's direct investigative resources to those that they're most effective in terms of their outcome of investigation. And so that's good practice. It's about having those established policies and practices that allow not only the department, but the community to understand what can they and should they expect from a police department once they file a case report. The other thing, too, is that consistent with the department is that the capture and utilization of data is not consistent, and it's not at the level of detail, and this is something that we struggled with. It's not at the level of detail to provide a lot of management insight in terms of what the police are doing. And so we have broad swaths of categories of data that are coming in, and normally when we go into a department, we will look at various things and aspects of what our normal data captures. Within Grand Rapids, part of it is because of the way state reporting is required, but also part of it is how they utilize data or how they capture it. We found that there were some, how would you say, less than insightful abilities to look at data. And when we talk about the patrol staffing, as you'll see from my colleague, is that when you have good data, you can make good decisions. And so one of the key recommendations is to make sure that we really are able to capture data in a way that allows managers to be informed, but also helps with crime solving. And then finally, civilian support for investigations. The Grand Rapids Police Department has one crime analyst. For an organization this size, that's not really an effective approach to really utilizing what are some of the advancements in law enforcement in the last decade. And so the ability to identify and direct resources based on anticipated crimes, levels of crimes, and frankly, overall demand. It's not all about crime. I mean, Grand Rapids is in a good position where you have community members concerned about quality of life issues. But having more information about that and being able to direct that in a data-led way really will help the department be able to, frankly, utilize scarce resources in its most effective way. Additionally, I spoke earlier about a pressure valve, expanding use of parking aids so that I'm not sending a police officer to a parking complaint, I'm sending a parking aid to that parking complaint will be helpful in terms of not only taking some of the pressure off of officers, but also giving the community some of what it wants in terms of visibility and support from its officers. Technology and data, I mean, none of these topics stand alone. They're very much integrated. And so you do have technology systems within the department. They're not being fully exploited. And again, that's consistent with an organization that has been very focused on demand, but being able to transition into a data-led, data-informed organization becomes important. And technology helps you do that. What we see is that a lot of the reporting capacity is not fully reviewed, fully analyzed in terms of what is the value returned to the department, and then allowing those decisions to be made to say, how are we using this data and why are we collecting it? Because if we're collecting data that we don't use, then it's, again, not a very efficient use. And so we really do stress the need for improvement on data collection and analysis. And because once you have that, you're able to make not only decisions about how you deploy, but where you deploy. And for management, they have insight and information about why am I incurring overtime here? What is the status of my vehicle fleet? I'll have that information as I collect it. And then as we stated, case management from start to finish, you have a civilian records unit that really spends a lot of its time on public records requests. And so internally within the organization, what was traditionally done by a records management unit is now transitioned to your investigators. And your investigators are spending a lot of time doing what in most organizations a civilian records unit would do. And so again, it goes to some of the issues in resource utilization. How do I want to use my resources? When we talk about succession planning, Grand Rapids is not much different than many agencies in Michigan, right? We froze hiring for about 10 years, and this chart's showing you the outcome of that, is that basically what you have is you have 127 officers with 20 plus years of service, and you've got 88 officers with less than 5. In between, that's who's growing to manage your organization here. And, concerning is the 5 to 9 year service. So you've got 12. So every one of those would be like a big boss at some point, right? But the goal is to make sure that the organization is positioned. Again, Grand Rapids has good practice here. You've allowed a certain level of overhire each year to help meet what you know is the looming event. But we highlight this to say that you have a big issue here and being able to plan for that issue. Some organizations do some lateral hiring, but being able to, and Grand Rapids has gotten a lot of recognition for its recruiting practices, which again are a good practice as well. But we highlight this to say is that you've got a chunk of individuals in the middle of your organization that we really need to focus on leadership development because they will be the leaders of your organization. All right, so at this point, I'm going to transition to my colleague, Alex, to talk about what specific to patrol staffing. But what we're identifying overall is that a strategic determination, and you just talked about your strategy here, but a strategic determination of how you're going to use your resources really is important because then that helps you to drive what your staffing plans are. But on this, I translate to Alex.
Thank you very much. Good morning. Good morning. We're going to talk about our analysis of patrol operations. The basic methodology that we utilized here is one that I and a colleague from Michigan State developed a number of years ago in conjunction with the Department of Justice. It looks at really the kind of quantification of patrol officer time. And we divide it into kind of two components. One, the time they spend on calls for service, and the time that's available for other kinds of activities. So first we look at the calls for service. And during 2018, we identified 60,185 calls for service. Now this is a particular kind of a finite definition. These are cases in which someone calls the police and a police officer or officers are dispatched. Okay, this does not include traffic stops, it doesn't include things that officers find on their own. It's simply these dispatch calls for service. I like to call them community-generated calls for service. So during the study period, there were about 165 per day on average, or about 7 per hour. Now, in terms of kind of the scale, on the days when the department staffs about 30 officers on the day, that's 15 on each of two 12-hour shifts, that would equate to about 6 calls per officer per shift, or about 1 every other hour. That assumes, by the way, that just the patrol division handles these calls. And in fact, some calls are handled by other units, by the community policing specialist. Some are handled by SRT and other uniformed forces. But that's just some sense about the scale. Here's the distribution by day of the hour of the day. This is pretty much what we'd expect in almost any law enforcement agency. Peak demand in the late afternoon time. What we found was interesting in Grand Rapids was the number of calls for service by day was almost equal across the day. No increase, this very small increased demand on the weekends. That's good in your case because the work schedule that you utilize produces essentially the same number of people each day. So if you had a schedule, if you had a big increase in the weekends, that would be a problem. Here's the distribution by month. Once again, no surprise, busier in the summers than other times. And here's the distribution by service area. They're roughly similar in terms of the proportion of calls that each handles. The central being the smaller of the two with a very kind of specialized workload demand. And here's the distribution by hour of the day, with the shifts begin at 6 p.m. and 6 a.m. It turns out there are more calls, slightly more calls during the day shift than the night shift. Now here's something that Deborah mentioned. These represent the most common types of calls. About 70% of all the calls are in this category. This is a good way of kind of looking to see what officers are doing. There's just a couple things I want to point out. There were 4,000 alarm calls. These are primarily burglar alarm calls. In most communities, 99.5% of burglar alarm calls are false, and that's certainly the case here. No reason to think otherwise. A lot of organizations in the country now are taking a more aggressive approach on dealing with burglar alarms. Cities like Milwaukee and San Jose are now using an approach called verified response. In the verified response communities, it's the responsibility of the alarm company to actually respond to the alarm. And if a crime has been committed, then the police are summoned. So significant reductions. Places like Milwaukee went from handling between 40 and 50,000 alarms a year to around 400 or 500. So it's a remarkable change. And of course, all of these alarm calls, by the way, require 2 officers. So they're an intense resource demand. We mentioned the parking violations. Once again, 3,600 parking violations that police officers are handling. And then another category that I like to talk about is kind of property damage, traffic crashes. This is an area in which a lot of communities have taken an alternative approach. Years ago, some of you may remember, the law required that if you were involved in a traffic accident, you remain at the scene until the police came. Now they tell you to move away from the scene, to get the car off the road. So very often when an officer comes, the scene's been cleared, the vehicles have been moved, and essentially what they're doing is filling out a report that describes the participants. Well, that same report could be done at the police station. The same report could be done online. So a lot of communities are saying if it's a minor crash, the vehicles don't have to be towed. If there's nobody injured, nobody's drunk, there are other ways to do this. So once again, it's substantial. So between those 3 categories, you're looking at a large fraction of all your calls for service. Here's the department uses a priority score depending on the urgency. It turns out the most urgent, priority 1, there were 1,100, so a relatively small fraction of the calls for service. And a lot of agencies worry about response time. Response time means different things to different people. In my view, the way you think about response time is what I call the hello to hello time. It's when someone calls 911 and someone says hello, until when an officer or a fire truck or an ambulance shows up in someone's home and says, hello, we're here to help you. That's what you really want to know, is how long does it take? So we looked at the performance for all calls for service and then for priority 1 calls for service. So it turns out for all calls for service, from the time someone contacts 911 until a police officer is dispatched is 12 and a half minutes, right? 12 and a half minutes. That's for all calls for service. But for priority 1 calls, the urgent calls, from the time someone calls 911 until an officer is dispatched is 1 minute and 30 seconds. Actually quite good. It indicates 2 things to me. One is that 911 center is working quite well. They got a process in place which, for priority calls, moves things through quickly. Plus, it also means that there are officers out there to send, right? It's not like they can't find someone. I worked a few years ago in the city of New Orleans where the priority 1 queue time was about 7 minutes, right? Before they even sent someone. Travel times are about 6.5 minutes for all calls and 5 minutes for priority calls. So that, once again, that means the hello to hello time on an urgent call is about 6.5 minutes, which is, given the geography of the city, given the workload, given the density of population, that's really quite good in my view. It turns out on average, police department officers spend about 50 minutes on the scene of a call. That's a little on the high side. Some of the cities I've worked with, it's in the 35 to 40 range, so it's a little bit high, somewhat reflected by this requirement to write a report on every call. That'll add to the on-scene time. Another thing we look at in our calculations is called the shift relief factor. It is the case that officers don't work every day, they don't work every hour, they get time off. So what we do is we do this calculation, which is illustrated here. Basically what we concluded is that the shift relief factor in Grand Rapids is 2.6. What that means is for every car that you want to put out on the street, you need to assign 2.6 officers to that shift in order to be reasonably certain that that car is going to be out there. If you want to put out 10 cars, that means you need to assign 26 officers to the shift. That's a fairly simple calculation. Now finally, we'll actually turn to the staffing analysis, and if it's okay, I'll kind of walk you through this. We've broken the deployment down into 2 shifts, starting at 6 a.m. and 6 p.m. I can walk you through the first shift. So we had 32,277 calls for service. Grand Rapids uses a very sophisticated approach for deciding whether or not to send a backup unit. It's based in part on the priority for the call, and it's also based on the kind of exigent circumstances. We applied that algorithm to the call data, and we concluded that about 35% of the calls require a backup unit, so we added 35% to our calls for service number. That's reflected in column 4. That we translated that to hours, 41,000 hours on calls for service. And the units measurement is a bit of an abstract notion. What we do is we say, suppose an officer worked every day and did nothing but handle calls for service. How many would it take? Well, that's the number you see. Of course, that's really not what we're interested in. But what we do want to know is, suppose officers spent 40% of their day handling calls for service and 60% involved in other activities. Patrol time, community engagement, administrative activities. So we can calculate that. In column 7, what we do is we take the number of units and multiply by 2.5. That's 100 divided by 40. And that tells us, in order to meet that performance objective of 40% calls for service time and 60% other, we need to have 24 officers on the street. Okay, that's the number that needs to be working. Now, in order to know how many folks we need to employ in order to get that, we multiply the 24 by 2.6, which was our shift relief factor. And that turns out to be 63. Now, what we've done in columns 9 through 12 is essentially use the same methodology, but with different allocation of time. For example, in column 9, we said, suppose they spend 50% of their time on calls and 50% on other things. And then finally, in 11 and 12, 60 and 40. So what you see in column 8 is the distribution for the 40-60 split. Under this assumption, you need 118 officers in patrol, and at the time of this analysis, they had 122. So the number of officers assigned to patrol is sufficient at using this methodology to both have to adequately meet calls for service and perform other activities. Now, it will be the case that on some days it'll be different. Some days there'll be a big traffic crash and half the folks will be tied up and you'll do less proactive work. Other days you'll have fewer calls for service. But in essence, what our conclusion was is that there are adequate resources in patrol based on this analysis. So I think now we can take questions.
All right, I will turn to my colleagues. So first, thank you both for your work. This is very informative, and as I agree with what the city manager says, that it will be probably incredibly useful for our next chief. I do have one question, and then I'll turn to my colleagues for questions. In the full report, you talked a bit about detectives and detective unit, and particularly talked about victims and reporting. Can you elaborate a little bit? I know some of us around this table have been concerned about the detective unit not having enough resources and making sure that we're able to respond. And so
Right.
can you just talk a little bit about your findings and thoughts? And I know you also highlighted some of the issues around work schedule and weekends and Mondays being busy. So I don't know if you can just elaborate on that a little bit.
Right. Unlike the patrol study, the detective unit analysis really has a little bit less science behind it because you're really looking at inflows and outflows. And so there's a variety of issues that I think are facing your detective unit. One, the case management approach. What cases get assigned and why? And so a lot of organizations focus on doing solvability factors in a consistent manner. Those get assigned. They're the ones that are most likely to be assigned. And then they have peel-off resources relative to those lesser crimes, making sure that residents get their responses and that they're able to have contact with an officer, find out whether or not there's any follow-on, et cetera. Your detectives do a lot of work in terms of management of reports that are traditionally done in other organizations by field supervisors and patrol. So they're reviewing and validating the initial case reports. They're entering those into a system that is used by the organization. Your detectives are also, as they work in a variety of other areas, formalizing reports for court, low-level reports, citations, they're walking things over, and so how your detectives are utilized in that regard are not as efficient. One of the things that we found is that the marking system for detectives, which is cases here in Grand Rapids, is sometimes, it's not consistent with what we look at nationally in terms of crimes, part 1, part 2. And as very much identified is that investigation is not just about following up on crime. They have other issues, runaways, death investigations, those things that are not traditionally crime. But the distinction between part 1 and part 2 crimes, all of which are not assigned to a detective, were 16,000. And I'm giving rough order numbers here. And then cases handled in that same year, and I believe it's 2017, were 22,000. And so there's a significant amount of work that's happening that doesn't necessarily match with traditional use of data. And so our recommendation for the detective division is to better streamline and identify how they're going to use their resources, bring in administrative support so that detectives aren't walking citations over to the courts. And then 2, looking at what is the utilization of patrol supervisors and what is their responsibility in terms of reviewing and approving initial reports. What that does do, though, is it transitions some of the responsibilities and duties to another unit. And so looking at that and to say, is that record reporting system as efficient as it could be? And are we better utilizing our resources? And Alex has a key.
Yeah, with investigations, there's really 2 issues with respect to the work schedule. One is they have a 4-10 work plan, which results in uneven staffing. So, for example, on Wednesdays and Fridays each week, only 50% of the detectives are assigned to work, whereas 100% work on the other days. That doesn't make much sense in terms of an operational perspective. The other thing which is problematic in my view is that they don't work in the evenings and on the weekends. And that results in a couple issues. One is, of course, that's when a lot of the crime takes place, particularly a lot of violent crime. Now, they get called out for some offenses, but for a substantial fraction, they don't get called out. As I understand, for example, a robbery of a convenience store, they won't get called out. So that means on a Friday evening, if a 7-Eleven store gets held up, that's mostly within the domain of patrol, and not much will happen until Monday morning. So in our view, it makes sense in a city of this size for investigators to work in the evenings and on the weekends. They all pointed out, by the way, about how difficult Monday morning is, and That's because nothing's happening over the weekend, right? But, public safety is a 24/7 enterprise. I mean, it's evidenced by the commitment that patrol makes to that. And this is not unusual. A lot of the cities I've worked with, investigators work during the day and have the weekends off. And it's a tough decision. I just point out, I worked with the city of Albuquerque, where even the gang and drug units work Monday through Friday, 8 to 4. It's hard to understand the rationale for that. But so I think it's an area in which you could improve performance by getting a more traditional work schedule where everybody works every day and having people work in the evenings and on the weekends.
Thank you. All right, I'll turn to my colleagues. Commissioners, questions? I'll start.
Well, you answered my question a few minutes ago, because I was going to ask you about the hours that the officers put in, but you just kind of explained that. To some degree, I think that they are overworked in terms of time, and that makes perfect good sense that if there's a regular time set for our officers, it would give them an opportunity to wind down as well.
I'm sorry, the question that whether they're overworked?
Yeah, well, what I'm saying, I'm being as simple as I can. I think that the time that you have earlier that you mentioned in terms of them working long hours, I think that it's important that they do have a time that they are able to work an efficient amount of time without burning themselves out. Because you kind of mentioned earlier, because one of the things that I kind of wrote down here is you said 42 hours a week in reference to adjustments.
That's a technical adjustment. The officers work a 12-hour workday, and they work 7 12-hour shifts in 2 weeks. That results in a 42-hour work week. So over the course of 2 weeks, they've actually worked an additional 4 hours. So what the department does is that they adjust one of those 12-hour shifts to 8 hours, so that it equates with a 40-hour work week. That's what I was referencing in that.
Okay, thank you, yeah.
But you are right, fatigue is an issue, particularly with 12-hour schedules, and there's been a lot of people who've talked about that. It's interesting, the research suggests that the most critical thing is what the officers do when they're off duty, rather than the rigors of, because many of them have childcare responsibilities, they go to court, some have other jobs. That's the thing you really have to watch pretty carefully.
And one more thing, could you kind of make it simple for me, because I'm not that smart. I'm smart, but I'm not that smart. The shift relief factor, you said 2.6. Can you explain that again?
Yes, what that means is for each police vehicle, for example, that you want out on the street, right? That means you have to assign 2.6 officers to that work group so that it's likely that the one will show up. Right? It's based on their time off, on their vacation, on their sick leave, right? In some sense, it's dynamic. It'll change as officers get more senior. It'll get changed, for example, if you have some long-term injuries. But one way to think about it in kind of straightforward terms is if you wanted to have 10 officers working on the street, we would multiply 10 times 2.6 in this case, which means that you have to assign 26 officers to that work group in order for the 10 to show up reasonably. It's a probability in some sense, yeah.
What the real issue is when you look at it, police are serving 24/7. Most of the population has a 40-hour work week. They go home and everything stops until the following Monday. That doesn't happen with policing, and so the ability to staff around the clock, that's what we're looking at. And then the other thing too is that these are all numbers, and as Alex identified, were they consistent? Were police dealing with just widgets? You wouldn't need people like us to come and talk to you, and you wouldn't have the expertise and the experience within the organization that you have. Is that policing is cyclical and you're staffing to demand. But we know that these are the basic numbers. These are the things that will take officers away from service, and that's what you need to replace them with.
Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Kelly?
Yes, thank you so much for this report. I do want to just mention that, and I appreciated the manager's reminder how we got here, that it was ICMA's recommendation as well as the Justice Department COPS grant information that we were given by 21st Century CP that recommended that we do this kind of deployment study. But I do have a question, and this is so helpful. I'll be eager to, I've read it through once, but have lots of questions, not enough time today. But you mentioned a minute ago that backup units, it depends on the circumstances. Can you elaborate on that, what that means? And I ask that because sometimes we get questions about backup, that sometimes the community feels like there's too much backup, but certainly we also recognize that there are going to be safety concerns. Right. So can you give us a little insight on that and how we might even address it with the community?
Yes, it's a kind of a two-stage process. One is they look at the call type and figure out what priority it is, right? But then they'll ask the complainant more information. I can give you a good example. Let's say someone's been gone during the day and they come home and they find the back door to their house open. It may have been that burglary took place 8 hours ago, right? But the person is waiting outside. They're not sure whether there's still someone in the house. Maybe there's some evidence of that. So that's one when you want to send it back up. It may be the case that someone called and said a burglary just occurred. People are in the area, once again. So you get as much information as you can. It's actually a good system because it doesn't rely simply on the priority scheme. Now, every community, every organization I've worked with always has some fraction of what I call self-dispatching, where officers will go in addition to those that have been assigned. Sometimes they'll do that based on their assessment of the situation, but that's beyond the kind of analysis. We don't include that in the backup data.
There's a subset to the backup issue as well, right? As we know, law enforcement officers have a dangerous job. And making sure that, very rarely, and I can't think of anywhere they would say they would have any prohibition about backup. But recognizing what are those calls that routinely get backup, recognizing what are the availability of officers to provide backup is important, right? Making sure that you have appropriate response. But on the flip side, you get some community response in terms of swarming. And certain events seem to draw a lot of police officers. And from a perspective within some communities, that's seen as over-policing. And so striking that balance between making sure what's an appropriate response and then what might be perceived as an over-policing response is one, a function of policy, and two, what we're talking about in terms of data analysis. When do I have officers responding to calls? Are they necessary at those calls? And what are my supervisors doing relative to managing those calls, right? And so, it's a balance between, what is a safety issue or what is an effective police response? Can I get people in the area to find, the bad guy? Or is it something that people are responding to and creating, frankly, more problems? I've had it in my other agency, fire department always used to yell because we'd have police officers blocking fire hydrants, et cetera, when they went to a call. So, how do you manage that scene response? So that's what we're speaking about, but the number that we identified was based upon the protocols of the department, and that's how we got what was an appropriate level of hours for response.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, other questions? Commissioner?
Yeah, one part I think went through kind of quickly was the concept of the succession planning, just knowing the amount of officers we have that are eligible to retire currently or will be on the horizon, just like many departments in the city, and then just kind of how you view the this expectation of the community expectation of high quality policing, and folks who have seniority often have done the job well and have a better grasp of how to do the job better. And the fact that we have like this looming cliff, essentially, of our most seasoned and veteran officers potentially being able to retire and then having to backfill that with younger, less senior officers who might not have the the lived experience to provide the quality and level of policing that we expect in our community. Can you speak to that at all?
That's an issue that's facing all of law enforcement. Right now, for a variety of reasons, law enforcement's having challenge in recruiting. And then, like I said, particularly within the Midwest, what you're seeing is this gap in terms of staffing that, for whatever reason, agencies were not hiring for a variety of years, based primarily on fiscal issues. So, part of what you're doing, and Grand Rapids has a good practice. You've been identified within the region as being more proactive in terms of recruiting. You've reached out and started offering scholarships to key candidates. The cadet program that we identified, which is the part-time replacement. So those are good things. The reality of what you're facing, though, is in fact what most agencies face. Now, there's a couple things here, right? Is that your officers don't have to say, I'm going to retire by this date. And so you're kind of forecasting, right? Because even though you've got 127 officers with 20 plus years of service, a lot of those can continue to work for, at least the next 8 to 10 years, right? The question is, will they? And some agencies are providing incentives over a 2-year period where they're better able to predict and progress what will be the retirement for the organization. So that's one way people are looking at it. But the other thing, too, is that when you look at this, you've got 80 officers within that 10 to 19-year range of service, and so you do have the expertise. But it becomes incumbent, particularly for the existing command staff and your new chief, to really identify what are those leadership skills that we require of our officers, and how are we going to develop that through our community? Because even these officers with less than 5 years, they'll be 7, 8, 9 years, and there are some good things to having a more youthful organization. They bring innovation, they bring some ideas. But within law enforcement, it's that balance of experience and innovation that you want to see, because you want to make sure that a dynamic, innovative atmosphere continues. And so there isn't an easy solution for that. I see some good practice here, particularly with the overhires year to year. But as a matter of the organization itself, they've implemented time rotations, so certain job categories that are seen as skills building, such as assignment to task force, are now have a timeout period that they can only go for, I believe it's 3 to 5 years. Problem is that everybody in that position already is more or less grandfathered, and so that kind of limits that leadership development. So then identifying more opportunities and ensuring that you share those opportunities with officers who are at that 10 to 5-year service as they start to come through the ranks.
And do you really think we've been overhiring?
No, I don't know. No. When I say overhire, and I don't claim to be a budget expert, so I'll step back here. But what you're doing is what a lot of organizations will do, is that normally for police, you have 4 retirements, and they were last year, so you can hire 4. Mm-hmm. But every chief and every department knows that, well, I'm going to have more retirements this year, and I'm always chasing the end game. And so here, what your practice is allowing you to do, and I've seen it in other cities here as well, so it's a good practice, is that you can hire to your anticipated absence. And so, not fully, but you can get a couple more bodies than you would normally based on actual absence. And so I don't claim to do good budget analysis here, but it's not overhire, that's the term, but you're not hiring just to your vacancies. And that's a good practice, because frankly in law enforcement, officers do retire throughout the year, and then you're always chasing. And what this identifies is that at some point in the next 5 to 8 years, you're going to have to be ready to do a much larger chase.
Commissioner Lanier?
Thank you so much for this presentation. I found the report quite thorough. And even your presentation today, easy to understand, this is a very complex system to try and understand, so thank you for that. I have 2 questions, and I'll start with the succession planning. So you talk a lot about civilian hires, but I don't feel like I quite understand how they should be hired and what categories of work. I think you talked a little bit about the detective unit and how we could possibly have civilians do some of that work. But do you have a number in mind? And if so, what categories, which areas of the department would you recommend for those hires? So that's one component. The other question, I think during the presentation, it was mentioned that in some agencies across the nation, they are making lateral hires. And I think that when you look at this chart, kind of this middle, I think that's the way to go. Personally, I believe that. And so I'm curious to know if you have any suggested methods of how we can go about recruiting kind of at this more senior than what we're getting under 5 years, some experienced officers in other communities, and especially as we're also trying to diversify the agency here locally in order to mirror the community that's ever changing. So those are my 2 succession planning questions. And then I also have a deployment question that I'll ask after these 2 questions are answered, please.
All right, I'll take the first question, or the second question, which is a little bit easier to address. There is some level of lateral hiring in the Grand Rapids department now. And so when we look at this less than 5 to 9 years of service, what you can see is that 16% of your officers have sufficient age for retirement. It's not a fully robust program, and so in the same way that you've committed to doing robust recruitment in terms of the academies, the ability to identify and pursue officers that are skilled from other agencies. A lot of law enforcement's engaged in that right now. Alex has identified that he works in Albuquerque. I mean, they'll hit local agencies and say, hey, our benefits are better, we got this. And so it's a little bit cynical in some ways, but it gets that local agency the resources that they need. And so in some ways, it becomes an organizational determination, and then two, identifying the capacity and the focus on recruiting laterally. So, and you know, it brings some skill sets because it brings different perspectives from other agencies, and that has value for a lot of organizations. Plus, it also limits that learning curve to some level, but then the downside of that is you need to make sure that you've got an officer that you want with that learning curve in your organization. So that one was easier. As to the civilian staffing, one of the unique factors of the GRPD is that there really weren't any civilian job codes for us to analyze, right? So we were not tasked with looking at communication, so you have a whole host there. And then within the forensics unit, because it's a specialty unit, we identified in terms of what you got staffed there, and they're staffed appropriately. Certain areas that we're looking at, and again, you've got detectives doing digital forensics evidence work. That could be staffed by civilian skilled staff. They're looking at the videos, they're the ones collecting the videos, doing phone analysis. You only have one crime analyst. We strongly suggest a review and the consideration of identifying 2 to 3. But understand too that the context that we come in here, and we heard it from the organization as well as the community, is that we need more officers here. And as Alex has identified, it's not necessarily the number of officers, it's what you have them doing. And so our report really focused on what do we believe that civilian support staff could help the organization do, and then thereby free more officer time, because at the end of the day, it's all analysis of hours and where your officers are. So you currently have parking aides, but they only work in the downtown region, and they only work a certain number of hours. Do you expand parking aides to the community to deal with the 3,600 calls for service on parking? You have, and again, the increase of digital and public records requests has hit a lot of organizations hard. And so how do I staff to that, and how do I make sure that that's happening? Within the detectives units in particular, the ability to have basic case processing, the case filing, the forwarding of cases to your prosecutor. There are some issues there that would require a shared vision with the prosecutor in terms of what do we want our detectives to do to support? Can we get them electronic resource access as well? Is it more effective to fax something over rather than walk something over? And so those are basic things that frankly could be analyzed within the overall concept. So when we're talking about whatever that number is, and I defer to the city on this, is that there should be recognition and analysis of that. These are certain areas that we know civilian staffing can help, and do we hire civilian staff to free up that detective? So one civilian gives me one officer, but then I have an officer doing something that's sworn law enforcement work. Is there anything I missed on that?
Yeah, I think I would agree on the need for, certainly for more analytical support. One way one might think about actually having an analyst for each service area, because that could really be a real aid to that service area captain in terms of developing strategy and using data to inform decision making. Also, we saw, and we pointed out in the report, for example, the traffic division, most of those folks are police officers. They spend almost all their time inside processing paperwork. So what I try to use as the guide, and which is really the industry standard, is if you look at a job, if the job requires either makes arrests or supervises people that make arrests, it should be sworn. Otherwise, it shouldn't, right? You can have someone non-sworn. So I think if you read through the report, you'll see lots of opportunities for those things. I think the best deployment is based on the goals and objectives of the city and the department.
And then, so the follow-up question regarding deployment is, so I'm sure that through your efforts, you've heard concerns about over-policing in some areas of the city. And just as much as that's a concern that we hear about, I also personally hear about concerns that the response rate is deplorable when there's an issue in another area of the city. And so I'm just curious to know if there was any work done on looking to see how officers were deployed, and if there were some inconsistencies in specific areas of town, where, and personally, I could have lunch with someone and sit in a restaurant and look out the window in an hour and a half and see probably 10 officers. And on that same day, I can get a call from a different neighborhood within my ward that there are a couple car break-ins and they haven't heard from anyone. And so I'm just curious to know if you've, through your efforts, if you were able to confirm that that's happening, and how do we go about staffing so that we can prevent that from happening, so that we can respond accordingly?
Well, we did talk about the response times in general. And as I pointed out, these are kinds of average performance, and they're going to vary with peak demand times. If it's a snowy day, things will take longer. If there's some big event in town, things may take longer. So there is, and some of the anecdotes you hear are true. Some of them, that people say, well, it took them an hour. It may have seemed like an hour, but it was actually 20 minutes. When you're waiting for the police, it seems like a very long time. We've all had that thing. But I think on balance, the response time is good. The department has a good method for deciding when to send a backup unit. It's consistent with the nature of the call. But as I mentioned before, in most communities, some officers will dispatch themselves, right? When I was in the Colorado Springs Police Department, I was a traffic sergeant, and one of the things that used to happen with some regularity is we'd have a crash on the freeway. We'd assign an officer to handle the crash, and invariably 3 or 4 others would show up and say, I'll help with traffic control. Well, this was a good thing for them. They could stand out there for an hour, not get any more calls for service, right? So what I had to do as a traffic sergeant, I had to go back and say, look, go back to work, right? We don't need you here, And so sometimes it's you have to kind of manage that resource. Officers will sometimes make decisions about calls they want to go to. In Deborah's old department in Chicago, it's not unusual for 20 people to show up at a shooting scene. They've only dispatched a couple. So it's up to the leadership to say, okay, there's enough of you here, go back to work. So that's more of a management challenge. And to the extent where you've had some incidents in which having more officers led to some controversy or consternation, then it's even more critical to say, okay, we have enough here now, let's go back.
Yeah, but I also think that we stress strategy here for a reason, because and the analysts are helpful, because why am I sending a police officer to this location, and do I need more people there? And so in the event where you have multiple car break-ins, ideally under a more agile response that's data-led, I would be able to identify that, hey, I need some more officers here, even on a day-to-day basis. And then being able to say, hey, you guys are all hanging out downtown getting the nice restaurant lunches, move on. But a lot of that is data-led, and then it's also about strategic use of my officers, right? And so the age-old issue, right? I don't see enough police, I see too many police, right? And trying to understand what are those analytic factors within that community, and what is my strategic plan for the use of my officers. Increasingly, because they're such a scarce resource, is that it used to be in the day that you'd give officer key, here's your beat, go conquer. And now being able to say, I need you to accomplish X, Y, Z in that percentage of time that I want you to be doing something other than answering calls for service, and then being able to measure that and hold to account. Annually, the department does look at rough staffing for the service areas, but there's not a robust appetite in terms of reviewing what is that performance, how are they working within these areas, and are we aligning our resources to the concerns within the community and also the crime issues. And so that's really where a better data-led approach, and then being able to use civilian support staff to help inform that, really will allow officers to, 1, take some of the pressures off in terms of what they feel they have to do, and 2, provide a more strategic viewpoint where the organization is able to measure and identify how they're using those officers.
Okay, thank you. And quick question, City Manager, I'm just curious to know, I'm making an assumption that you've probably had discussions already with leadership in GRPD. I'm just curious to know kind of what are their initial thoughts on this, and then what's the process for kind of sharing it throughout the agency so that we can kind of hear their feedback from the officers. And because if you've heard from them that they're fatigued like on a Monday, I'm just curious to know kind of what their feedback has been thus far.
So I'll turn to City Manager, and then I'll go to Commissioner Part, and then Commissioner Jones, and then I'd like to ask one final question about methodology. City Manager?
Thank you. I was going to do this towards the end. but I'll go ahead and do it now. I had some preliminary conversations with Chief Kittle about the results of the report, and a couple of things. There are things that we need to consider, I need to consider, short-term, in light of the upcoming budget, and there are others that I think can be deferred for more long-term strategic analysis. But immediately, conversations that we've had have been around both recognizing the attrition that currently exists, either through retirement or other turnover reasons, or when difficulty in staffing positions, and that this change cannot happen right away. There will need to be some runway for some of this transition to occur. However, at the same time, there are other parts of our community that are asking for more community police specialists. And I think in the past couple of years, we've heard the request coming from the department to add more. And so what I am considering is balancing the need to do some of the short-term, take advantage of some of the short-term opportunities around some of the areas where the officers can get more support, like on crime analysis in the detective unit. I had the privilege to sit in the Emergency Operations Center during the presidential visit. And what I observed from the one crime analyst that was on site there was just absolutely phenomenal in terms of the kind of data analytic and predictive things that the employee was able to provide to the department. And so I think that's a resource that might be able to, more resources, I would agree that that would be able to help the department in terms of crime resolution. The other area that I don't think we spent a lot of time on was in the property unit. That's an opportunity to provide more support staff and potentially redeploy some officers to operations. So my conversation preliminarily with the chief and the budget staff has been about looking at a balance of what some of those short-term things we can do, and perhaps if we can redeploy enough officers and add a couple of more officers in this coming, a few officers in this budget. What I understand in the immediate need is that we do not have any community policing specialists in the evening. And so those are some of the considerations that we're having right now. Regarding the departmental response, like any other study, we will take the information, just like we did with 21CP, and have the department review it, and then come back and prepare a response, both for me now, as well as we'll be expecting a new police chief to continue to evaluate the study.
And City Manager, just to make sure we're all clear, this isn't the first time. The draft report was already shared with the department a couple weeks ago, is that right?
That is correct.
Thank you. So they've seen the draft for a
So
couple
all the
weeks.
entire agency saw the draft a couple weeks ago?
The chief will have to come and discuss how the department has been informed about the study. My conversations have been with the police chief and several of his command staff.
Okay, thanks.
Hi, Chief. And then I'm going to have both of you stay up because Commissioner Part and Commissioner Jones has a question, and then I also have another question. So, Chief. Welcome.
Good morning. As the city managers mentioned, this is a fairly recent report for us as well. We did see a draft, and I will be, a few of us snuck away last week for spring break to warmer climates, so that took some time as well. The department just got the final report. Actually, I sent it out Saturday night to them as a whole, so that's the first time they've seen it. Command staff did see it. Captain saw it, the draft, like a couple weeks ago. So we will work through it. We certainly need more time to fully analyze it and review it. Certainly, we're going to need broader discussions with you all as well as the community in regards to services that we do want to provide moving forward. We do pride ourselves on the full service department that we are now, and some of the suggestions in the report do suggest that we cut some of those services. So that's going to be a broader community discussion. And just to reiterate what the city manager was saying in regards to our budget request over the last 4 years, each of those 4 years we have requested 10 additional officers. That has not been for patrol operations, though. That has been for community policing specialists in the evening hours, and that's been a direct request to us from the community and the neighborhood associations.
Thank you. Great. Thanks, Chief. So I'll turn to Commissioner Part and then Commissioner Jones, and then I have one more question. Oh, go ahead.
And may I also add, Mayor, and just to for the commission to take in consideration in the public. This is not the only report that informs staffing needs for the department. 21st Century Policing recommendations also had some recommendations regarding staffing. And so I just want the commission and the public to understand this is, for me, one of the factors that I will be taking into consideration in the budget process and not the sole factor.
Great, thanks. Commissioner Park?
Could we go back to the staffing estimate slide? I think I just have, I just have a couple clarifying questions because if you change any one of those numbers, the numbers at the bottom change, right? So I just want to make sure this 35% number around backup, is that actual or is that a standard industry recommended
No,
number?
we actually took the scheme that the city uses to decide whether a backup unit is sent and applied it to the actual data.
Okay.
And then we determined based on that 35% of the calls were getting a backup unit assigned.
Is there a number, is that 35%, is that what it ought to be, or is there a different number?
It's fairly typical. Sometimes we actually have to estimate this, and I often use 25%. So that's pretty reasonable.
Okay.
That's about where you'd expect it to be, yeah.
My other question is about the 40% on calls for service, 60% on, other activities.
Right.
You gave us 50 and 60, but is the 40-60, is that really the target that is recommended?
Well, it's an interesting question. People often ask me, is there some kind of goal? It's actually a little bit more complex than that. It depends in part on how you want officers to spend their time. There are cities, for example, that have large numbers of specialized units. They have street crime units, they have gang units, they have drug units. In those places, the expectation is that patrol officers will spend more of their time handling calls for service and less time on proactive activities. At this level, what you're just suggesting is that we want our officers to spend 40% of their time on calls for service and the remainder on proactive activities. That's, in some sense, it's a policy judgment. In some sense, it reflects what Deborah's mentioned a number of times. It's the strategy for the best use of those resources. If you, for example, said, well, we want them to spend 60% of their time on calls for service, that would leave relatively less time for proactive activities, some activities but you'll also notice that it drops the number down to 81, right? So that would free up about 40 officers that you have in patrol. Now, you could take them and put them in specialized units. So it's a choice, right? In other words, how do you best want to use the patrol resources?
Okay. I think my third question is, you made a statement that I just want to clarify. You said that you only analyze calls for service. That doesn't include traffic stops and other things like that. So how does that data get incorporated into the
That becomes
matrix?
part of the 60%.
Okay.
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
And that's why strategy becomes important, because you have 60% of your time unallocated. Somebody's not calling you on average. And so what does the department want those officers to do? And, some of the struggles around with community policing is until I can get a person hired, am I tasking officers to have specific ownership around community policing principles, right? Right now, the CPS or CSU works days, all right? So on nights and weekends, who's tasked to help facilitate those relationships with the community? That's what happens in the 60%. Proactive stops, observation on site, on view types of events. Those are all part of your 60% as well.
Nice. Commissioner Jones?
Sure, thank you, Mayor. Ms. Kirby and Dr. Weiss, want to thank you very much for your expertise and your presence here. My first question is a rather basic question, just for those who are here as well as the viewing public, those who are listening. How many studies have you done and where? Just the ballpark. How many have you done?
I've done at least 40 staffing studies, ranging from small sheriff's departments to large cities, Louisville, Albuquerque. I've done Lansing, Michigan, Traverse City, Michigan. Recently completed a study for the Puerto Rico State Police, and I've just finished a 3-year engagement with the National Park Service, studying law enforcement in the parks and for the U.S. Park Police.
Okay, very good.
For my larger firm, we've done tens of dozens of various activities engaged in supporting and advising public safety and law enforcement. I've been with the firm for 3.5 years, and I've probably participated in maybe 20 to 25 right now at this point. But we also bring a lot of executive expertise to the firm as well. And having served 28 years for me with the Chicago Police Department and looking at various organizations through that point. And then our law enforcement practice lead was the former head of San Jose Police Department, and he's worked across the country for the last 14 years. So I'd say that he's got a good number under his belt as well.
Okay, very good. I can appreciate that. I think it's fair to say that this is not your first rodeo, and I appreciate that. I also appreciate about the report that you provide, I think, for our city, a strategic lens to look through with regards to policing. And I can't say enough about how critical and important it is in this day and age to be able to have that available. I also want to make mention of something that you said that I thought was also very important, in that you were very explicit in saying it's not about capacity and ability of our officers. The professionalism is intact, correct? So that was your review of the time that you spent here in Grand Rapids. That is not in question. I also want to make mention of the fact that I think in many ways, we are, you may have heard, but we have undergone quite a few studies over the years, and I think the term that has been used quite often is paralysis by analysis, and I think that in some ways it's fair, but in some ways it's very short-sighted, in that we have a responsibility to be good stewards of the funds that we oversee, and we would probably be derelict in our duty if we didn't take the opportunity to take a deeper dive into what is the best possible way to go forward, and to do it through and to use a very strategic lens to do so. And so I want to close with this. I want to make it perfectly clear, and I think some of my colleagues have mentioned it. Your recommendation, your suggestion is the adding of personnel. But again, you have been very prescriptive in what that personnel should be and what they should be doing. And so it's not a question of whether or not personnel should be added. You're saying, yes, we need to add personnel. But you're very, very specific in where they need to be. Fair assessment?
I think that's accurate, yes. I think, yeah. Right. Particularly, there's some real gaps on the kind of support side of the shop, yes.
Mm-hmm. Okay, very good. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Two final thoughts, and then I'll turn it to our city manager to close. Two things. One, can you just briefly talk about the methodology of choice? I know you talk about it in your report, that there's basically 4 different approaches, and you really go through why you selected your approach. And I think it's helpful for us, but also the community, because we have heard numbers or I should say, what is needed based on some of the approaches that you say is not the best approach. So I'm just wondering if you can touch on that. And then my second question really is just as in follow-up to what Chief Kittle said, because I want to be very clear that at least how I read the report, you're not recommending cutting services. What you're recommending is shifting some of those responses to non-sworn officers, like let's say, for instance, the parking aids, or verifying false alarms so that we're not sending officers to a false alarm, to free up time to focus on other things. So I want to be thoughtful that we don't use the word cut services if, at least in my impression in reading the report, that is not what you're proposing.
These are really alternative delivery methods. I think that's a better way to describe it.
Thank you.
With respect to the methodology, traditionally agencies have used 4 different methods to determine what's the appropriate number of police officers. The one that's been most commonly used is what I call the population rate. You calculate the numbers of officers per population. This has been around for a very long time. Actually, years ago, when J. Edgar Hoover was the head of the FBI, agencies used to ask him, communities say, how do I know how many officers my community needs? And of course, he didn't know the answer to that. But as an alternative, they actually started calculating these rates. So at least an agency could say, well, our agency has 2.1 officers per 1,000, and Right next door, they have 2.2, so perhaps we don't have enough. So this has been a kind of an industry approach. It's been fraught with peril for a number of different reasons. If one were to look at, and I shared this graphic with the agency, if one looks, for example, the rate of officers per 1,000, the rate of officers per 1,000, for example, in Chicago or in Washington, D.C. or New Orleans is 4 or 5 times higher than it is in Los Angeles, right? Now, the reason for that is, these are all obviously they're big places, they have lots of crimes. It more reflects how officers are utilized. It represents some kind of what I would call kind of inefficiencies, right? Lots of places use 2-officer cars, for example, routinely. A lot of places have officers doing jobs that should be done by non-sworn people. So, as it turns out, in the eastern part of the United States, the officers per population ratio are quite high. In the western, they're quite low. But more importantly, that ratio doesn't really tell you anything about the quality of service delivered or the manner of service delivery. It's just a number. And unfortunately, lots of places have used this. What's interesting is the International Association of Chiefs of Police, which is kind of the benchmark for leadership, has recommended to its members not to use this standard. They say, just don't do it, right? Because they understand the weaknesses of that approach. The 2 other methods that are common are what's called the kind of minimum staffing approach. Lots of communities, particularly ones with smaller numbers of officers, just say we need to have a minimum number of officers working at a time. They may say it's 2 or 3. It's based on their assessment of kind of public safety, based on the workload. It's very, very common. Sometimes it works its way into the contract, actually, where it says X number of people have to be working each day. The problem with that, of course, is it's not based on an analysis of the workload. It's just based on some assumptions about what the appropriate number is. I've worked with communities, for example, where the actual minimum staffing level was probably too low. I mean, it was putting some officers in peril. Others in which it's set so high that they're constantly hiring people back on overtime to fill these minimum staffing levels, right? Because the minimum staffing level is very close to the actual number that they have. The third method is what we call the authorized budget approach. Every city has a number in a budget some places. Say we're authorized 211 police officers. As my colleague pointed out, most agencies can never get to that number because people leave faster than you can replace them, right? So almost every agency is below the authorized strength. And what police executives often do is they say, well, we're supposed to be at 211 and we're at 205, so we're 6 short, right? The problem with that, of course, is that it's not always clear that 211 is the right number, right? Some agencies, by the way, never get to the authorized strength. They constantly stay below it. And then finally, we use this workload-based model, which is what I described today. We developed this method in conjunction with the Department of Justice. We brought in a group of police planners from around the country, spent a few days with them, talk with them about the challenges they face in this allocation, about the data problems. And we came up with this plan, which is the one we use today, which has now been used in scores of communities. And I'm proud because the manual keeps getting published by the Justice Department. They keep distributing, so it seems to be working in that sense. But those are the 4 methods. But I think it's frustrating because people look around at their nearby communities and they say, well, we must need more. It's not a good way to go.
Thank you. Thank you for elaborating on that because I think that's an important point that we all fully understand as well as the public. So thank you. All right, with that, I'll turn it to our city manager to close. And I'll add my thanks to both of you for all of your work as well as everyone in the department that helped. Thank you.
Yeah, again, my appreciation as well, Mayor, to our consultants as well as the department for the work in bringing forth the study. I want to remind the commission, about my earlier comments, there is no decision for this body to make at this time. We will bring back items at the appropriate time and make a decision, and one will be with the beginning of the budget process. So at that point, when we're talking about resourcing the department, we will ask for your re-engagement in this topic, but did not want to catch you cold for lack of a better term, without having the discussion first. That will be the first opportunity. And again, during that moment, we will not be able to fund all the needs that remain in the department without balancing that against some of the other fiscal needs. The second opportunity will be once we have a new chief to look at some of the more long-term recommendations that are going to require very deliberate action by the department. This will be a point of information not just for the fiscal process, but also the hiring process to make sure that we hire a chief that's able to deal with the complexities of our police department in terms of the strategic direction of how to deploy staff. So again, my appreciation to consultants and all the officers, and thank you for this time.
Great, thank you. All right, so we will move to our next item, and this is an update on Opportunity Zone. So I'll get this started with Mr. DeLong. That's who I have down on my list.
I will come here just for a moment to introduce Ms. Wood.
Ms. Wood, all right.
And Mr. Mraz.
And we have representative from the right place, Mr. Tim Mraz, also to talk about Opportunity Zones. So we'll turn this over to Kara. Commissioners, many of you are familiar with this new tool that was created by the federal government, and we were involved a little bit at the state level because it was actually up to MSHDA to identify opportunity zones and submit those. Are we ready? So Kara, do you want to get started? I was just talking in the interim to tee this up.
And Mayor, in the interim, if we could, I'll ask the staff, given the time, if we can be as brief as possible. I know this is an important conversation. I want to reserve much of the time for discussion and just presentation.
It's a good thing I'm a fast talker. All right, so what we want to do today is provide an overview of Opportunity Zones. This is a federally regulated program. I've got Tim Mraz here from the Right Place, who is our regional expert on this topic, and we will co-present this material to you. So today we want to provide information on how the law works, review other practices across the country, and discuss ways to partner and incent desired investment within our community that has desired community benefits, along with outlining our next steps.
Great, thank you. Welcome. Mr., I call him the Opportunity Zone expert here in our community and region, so glad you could be here with us today.
Thank you. That's a very strong phrase, but I appreciate it.
You're pretty good.
Just a few things before we get started, a few caveats to this program. One, I want you to know this is turning into an extremely complex program. There's over $2 billion being invested into this program nationwide. There's only 100 pages of federal proposed rules and regulations that are being applied to this. So that tells you how complex this is. Again, we have no finalized rules and regulations for this, but this is an investor incentive that's awarded to investors for their investment. This is not a traditional program like a brownfield redevelopment program. It's something you would fill out an application for. You would go through an auditor review. This is between an individual investor, their investments, and the IRS. So this is a private investment program. All investments for this program pertain to capital gains. So these are the attempt of this legislation was to open up what are perceived as billions and trillions of dollars that are on the sideline, that are tied up in potential capital gains that are not being reinvested into communities. That could be anything from like the sale of a business, sale of stock, sale of property. The belief is that a lot of these assets are being held right now and not being sold because of the tax liabilities that go along with them. So this legislation was an effort to open up those avenues for investment. Again, the other thing I want to propose is that all the current regulations are still proposed. We do not have final rulings on this yet. They are expected hopefully by June if we can get those. So to start out real quickly, just some definitions. What is an opportunity zone? Opportunity zones are low-income census tracts. There have been a lot of questions with a lot of maps that have been thrown around on who drew these maps, why were these designated a certain way. The maps were not drawn. The zones that were designated are existing low-income census tracts as designated by the federal government. So that's how they were selected. They were selected by state, so each one of the 50 states were allowed to designate what opportunity zones they wanted to have in their state, and I'll go through those in detail in the next slide. And again, where did they come from? They were established by Congress at a federal level through the 2017 Tax Cut and Jobs Act. It was a tax reform bill that came out in 2017 that was enacted in January 2018. Just for a quick background, the champions behind all this were two senators, Senator Cory Booker out of New Jersey and Senator Tim Scott out of South Carolina. So it was a bipartisan group that put this plan together. How are they designated? Governors of every state were assigned to nominate up to 25% of their low-income, high-poverty census tracts as opportunity zones. In the state of Michigan, we have I think the number is about 1,125 total low-income census tracts. The governor was allowed to nominate 25% of those, which ultimately ended up as 288 statewide. Governors were given broad discretion on where they wanted to designate those zones. If you look at the different various 50 states, you will see that different governors took different strategies and approaches to this. Many of them congregated those opportunity zones around sort of already thriving urban areas, and try to use it for selective infill. A lot of our plain states use them to do more rural development. One of the things I will say to our governor's credit, our previous governor's credit, Governor Snyder, when he was assigned this, one of the things that he did was he asked MSHDA, who was ultimately assigned this, to say, we can assign opportunity zones wherever they are eligible. However, I do want one at least in every county, and so that it was dispersed throughout the state. We did achieve that, bearing in mind one county, and the only reason one county wasn't involved is because that one county did not have any low-income census tracts. So.
Wow, what county is that? Oakland.
Benzie.
Benzie. Oh, interesting. I wouldn't have guessed that.
Your trivia for the morning. Again, how are they designated? As I mentioned, in the state of Michigan, Governor Snyder assigned this whole program to MSHDA, the Michigan State Housing Development Authority. Part of the reason for that was a large part of the PR around this program when it was announced was that this was going to be another housing program. And what I will explain a little bit later is housing is but one thing of many that it can be used to make investments in. But so when this came down, a lot of people interpreted this as a housing program. It was then assigned to MSHDA. And real quick, as I said, there were 288 tracts statewide. In Region 4, which is what we consider our West Michigan region, there are 26 opportunity zones designated within the 13 counties that are in our region. Most of the counties have 1, Muskegon 4, Kent County actually has 10, with 8 in Grand Rapids and 2 in Wyoming. There are 2 in Montcalm County and 2 in Mecosta.
So working with the Michigan State Housing Development Authority, we were able to nominate 8 census tracts in the city of Grand Rapids. We narrowed our recommendation to these census tracts, 26, 28, 30, 32, 35, 36, 37, 38, with a focus on wanting to eliminate disparities, reduce lead concentration in our neighborhoods, and include the neighborhoods of focus. So these census tracts also have multiple development project opportunities, a lot of city planning and economic development initiatives underway, all of which have included some level of community and stakeholder input and opportunities for engagement. Things like the Corridor Improvement District authorities, the business area specific plan in Southtown. We have the Rapid Silver Line investment, the South Division plan, and the opportunity at 201 Market. Here's a map where we have overlaid on the residential security rating map from 1937, those red line districts, our neighborhoods in focus are in pink, and then the opportunity zones in blue. So there is alignment with our neighborhoods of focus within those 8 census tracts we were able to designate.
All right, my turn. So again, this is another slide. I will put a caveat on it. This is an extremely high-level description, so please do not make any investments based on what I say here. So the best way to explain this is through an example. One of the example I give is, for instance, you bought Apple stock several years ago. You are now ready to sell it. By the sale of that stock, you are going to get $1 million in capital gains. So now you have $1 million. What are the benefits of this program, as you see in the slide? The first one is a temporary deferral. So what it simply allows you to do is if you take that $1 million and you invest it in what's called an opportunity fund, you can defer paying taxes on that $1 million as an investor for a period of 10 years. So just a simple deferral. The second one is an actual reduction. So once that opportunity fund, you make that investment in an opportunity fund, after a period of 5 years, the tax liability is reduced by 10%, so that $1 million is now reduced to $900,000 essentially in what you would pay in taxes. After 7 years, it goes down to another 5% for a total of 15% discount on what you would pay in your taxes, the tax liability of that. The third one, which is gaining much of the attention on this program, is any capital gains on an investment made through an opportunity zone into a project that you will eventually make money on. So say you take that $1 million, you invest it into a project, that project, you hold it for 10 years, you sell whatever it is, that housing development or whatever it is, you sell it after 10 years. Whatever money you make off of that housing development, those capital gains, that would be capital gains, are tax-free.
Wow.
So it's kind of like a Roth IRA.
Yeah.
Real quick, opportunity funds. Sounds like a lot of people in the crowd are getting some ideas.
That was an aha moment, I think.
So, real quick, opportunity funds. All opportunity.
Ruth just had $1 million she wanted to invest.
John's trying to figure out where can I put capital gains.
I don't have any of those.
So real quick on opportunity funds are simply a vehicle for investing in opportunity zones. Before I go any further, that's one additional correction I want to make, is that these opportunity funds, the only thing that can be in these opportunity funds are capital gains. So you can't take cash on the side. If you got cash in a bank, you can apply it towards a project, but none of that cash will apply towards the benefits that you would get that I just talked about out of this project. So it's really only a program for dealing with capital gains. As I said here, you know, these are the mechanisms, the opportunity funds, and they are a legally created document, IRS form that you have to fill out. There are some asset tests, which is great. The great thing about this program is when they launched it, they said, you know what, we want you to actually invest in projects. We don't want you to just cash in these capital gains, put them in a fund, just sit on it for 10 years and say, I'm sorry, I didn't see anything worth investing in. Where's my discount? So at every 6-month interval, once you create a fund, it is actually tested, and 90% of that $1 million in this example that you have invested, 90% of that actually needs to be invested into a project within an opportunity zone. If it doesn't, there are penalties you pay for that. So that's a good thing that happens.
Tim, can you, correct me if I'm wrong, but at our local level, none of that information is shared with us at the local level. So we wouldn't know who's investing in what opportunity zones or what projects. All of that is at the federal level, federal reporting that doesn't come back down to the local level.
Correct. This entire thing is between an individual investor and the IRS. So when a project goes through planning and zoning, unless a question is specifically asked, is this project being funded through an opportunity zone or through an opportunity fund, you will not know. Some projects are actually promoting it because they want the designation of that. But in terms of planning and zoning and applications, it'll just be another LLC coming through, just like most other projects.
Which is a question I've been asked, commissioners, like what are we going to be able to do at the local level? And the reality is that this is really between the investor and the federal government. We don't approve these funds. We don't approve any investment in an opportunity zone.
Correct.
We can't regulate, but we can incentivize if we want the development to occur in certain areas with certain type of community benefits.
Yes.
And we'll talk about that more.
You said you can incentivize?
Incentivize.
Yes, ma'am. So real quick, who can invest and create opportunity funds? Basically anybody. Any one of you can create one. There are a lot of personal funds that are being, those of us that qualify, sorry, Commissioner Kelly, you and me are in the same boat. Individuals can create opportunity funds. Groups of partners can create opportunity funds. Large institutions, PNC Bank has an opportunity fund, a national opportunity fund. So they're at all levels, multifamily houses. There's really very few, if any, exclusions that prevent anybody from creating an opportunity fund. We expect, and we're actually seeing this, that many opportunity funds are differentiating themselves based on themes, from anything from a geographic scope to an investment type or a management style. So you have opportunity funds that are being created that are promoting green energy investments, and they will fund projects because that's what they know, and they will fund projects around green energy. We have ones that are around affordable housing. We have ones that are around hospitality. The most interesting one I've seen so far is ones that are actually interested in doing sports arenas. I don't know how sports arenas in low-income neighborhoods work together, but apparently they're investing in that as well. So, what can an opportunity fund invest in? Basically, there's three large buckets of property, or three large buckets of things that they can invest in. One is actual property. You can buy property within an opportunity zone. The other one is you can establish a partnership, so you can go in with other partners to establish a project. And the third one is the most interesting one to the right place. You can actually take an equity stock position in a company. So if a company is looking to expand, you want to invest in that expansion, you want to fund that expansion, you can actually fund that expansion, but do it in a way that you take an equity position in the company. The idea is you hold that equity position for 10 years. After 10 years, you sell it back to the company, and any money that you would make off that growth would be tax-free. So, other things you can invest in, as I said, this was launched as a housing project, or perceived as a housing project, but you can really do anything. These are just a few examples that we have seen pop up. Startups, incubators, Main Street business initiatives, real estate, manufacturing facilities, brownfield redevelopments, rental housing. I mean, there are very few things that you cannot do, and actually, per that last bullet, there are so-called sin businesses that are excluded from this. It's actually a finite list from the federal government of businesses that they don't like. One of them is tanning salons. Why, I don't know, but the federal government does not like tanning salons. One of the things that was noticeably missing from that list were marijuana-related businesses. If you do a Google search for opportunity zones of marijuana right now, you will get thousands and thousands of articles that have been written so far. The latest that came out from legal counsel from the IRS, their current interpretation was, quote, "I wouldn't do it."
Listen to the IRS.
The most widespread interpretation right now is because marijuana is still federally illegal, why would they take the time to put something that's already illegal on the illegal list? If you did that, you would
So
put out.
tanning salons are, but not.
Yes. So.
Bad. Huh.
This is federal legislation. The one gray area that people are starting to identify right now, just so you guys are aware of it, is that there are some pretty strict liquor control rules on that sin list, but they were written very generally. So people are wondering, if you open up a brewery or anything that is other than a liquor store, how does that fit into that as well? So again, those get to be very complicated as well if there's anything that involves alcohol in the establishment. Some other fun facts. The way these are built and constructed, they can actually they can actually be part of any part of the capital stack for a project. For those of you where that rings with, there are certain things in federal programs. If you apply for this grant or this abatement or this tax program, it'll bump out something else in the tax stack because you can't use both of those at the same time for one project. This can stack up at any given point, the beginning, the top, or the middle. So. Also, this Opportunity Fund projects do not give anybody a free ticket. You are still subject to all taxes, property taxes, and everything else you would normally pay. To address the concern earlier, question of how will we know if this is an Opportunity Fund investing in this project? Again, this does not give them a free ticket to develop or create anything they want. They are still subject to City of Grand Rapids planning and zoning and regulations and processes and appeals and things like that. So they will still go through the regular process. It does not require, or does not allow them a get out of jail free card for any of that.
Tim, can I ask a question on this slide? The Detroit Opportunity Fund, who set that up? Was it the city?
It's actually a gentleman out of New York.
Okay.
It's a private investor out of New York.
So private investor, but he or she is calling it the Detroit Opportunity Fund.
Correct. It's a private investor out of New York that bought several hundred pieces of property at the end of the 90s and beginning of 2000s in Detroit. Okay. And is now looking to do something with those properties. So.
Because property owners can also create an opportunity fund.
If they have the capital gains to do it.
They have the capital. Okay.
So real quick, I'm a visual person, so I always like to put this up here. This is kind of in visual form. What we just talked about is the process is you take a series of capital gains, a lump sum of capital gains, you invest them in a fund. The fund can be yours. The fund can be somebody else's, a partner's. It could also be in institutions. That fund then can invest in any one of those three things. It can invest in property, it can invest in a partnership, or it can invest in equity stock in a company. It is not a one-for-one either. You can, if it's $1 million that you have, 300,000 of it can go into an equity position in a stock position in a company. 700,000 of it can go into a housing project. It can be split up however you want. There are no minimum investments for this. for policy.
So just real quickly, a couple of things that affect opportunity zones as of late. Governor Whitmer issued an executive order indicating that 3% of state expenditures should be made to disadvantaged businesses and/or businesses located in qualified opportunity zones. So there is a statewide initiative to do business with, make investments in these opportunity zones. In addition, the presidential executive order in December of 18 created the Opportunity Council to drive federal funding into qualified opportunity zones. So these are going to be desirable areas for investment, not only in projects, but in existing businesses that operate there currently or operate there in the future. Locally, when projects require local support, we could focus our economic development incentives that promote community benefits in these zones, and also consider geographic purchasing incentives as well. So we can be creative with how we layer our incentives in these areas to stimulate more activity. We could focus potential affordable housing fund investments, other state and local environmental grants and loans, voluntary equitable development agreements could be promoted here, as well as our infrastructure capital investments.
All right, so for the approach, how is this program playing out nationwide? The term I'm going to introduce you to is the term prospectus, which is something that communities are not used to hearing about. Again, this is an investor program, therefore this is investor terminology. What communities are doing around the country are creating essentially what are called community prospectuses. I did look that up, it is not prospecti. The prospectus is essentially an investment prospectus that you would pitch to an investment group or an opportunity fund for investment in your community. We can talk about things that it would include, but it's essentially about building assets and what do you have to market in your community. You would, like I said, you would essentially market those opportunity funds, there is a possibility of creating new opportunity funds in the Grand Rapids market for our local community. I have spoken with several law firms and accounting firms in the community, and there are local opportunity funds being created today in our community. So, in terms of the prospectus itself, it is literally a document. Many of them can be downloaded because they're public documents. I provided the City of Louisville to the city. I have probably a dozen and a half printed off in my office myself that I use for reference. It's a combination of community marketing strategy, economic development analysis, and private investment memorandum. So essentially, they are a standardized template. There is an organization at the national level that has come out and said, look, as communities start to do this, so every community is not running in every direction trying to build these things. Here is a standard process or a standard template that communities can follow, so that when investment groups are analyzing 12 different communities that they want to invest in an affordable housing project, they can essentially open up to page 18 of all those prospectuses and start comparing city to city to city to city. What they don't want are quote unquote creative approaches where you turn in a 114-page prospectus and they have to hunt for your data on how you compare to Kansas City versus Austin versus New Orleans. So that's how these are working. On the other area real quick, on that slide, the bottom one, it should include specific areas or projects that are in demand. Again, you're going to be marketing to opportunity funds, or the right place will be marketing to opportunity funds that have no idea who or where Grand Rapids is. So you cannot assume that everybody knows where Hall Street is. You can't assume everybody knows where Hall and Madison is. So you need to call out specific projects and in specific areas that you would like to see investment in.
I have a question.
Tim,
are these open to individuals outside of the United States as well?
No, this is U.S. capital gains.
Okay.
Yep. It is subject to the 5 territories of the U.S.,
okay.
but it's 50 states.
Okay.
Components of a prospectus, these are just kind of a high level of what it would be, basic demographics and data on your community. Again, those specific investable opportunities, whether they be businesses, projects, things that you'd like to see in your community. What are the strategic advantages? What are those industry clusters? What are those strengths and challenges that you have in your community? What are your economic development priorities? What are your available incentives? One of the things that we're seeing, the classic example I shared with the city earlier, it was the city of Baltimore. City of Baltimore's mayor came out and said, essentially, if you want to invest in a project using an opportunity fund in one of our opportunity zones, everything that you would qualify for at the local level, I will double. So if it's a 7-year tax abatement, it's now 14. If it's a $5,000 infrastructure grant, it's now 10. Whatever that happens to be, they're sort of doubling down on this one. So, and we're seeing that across the country.
So as an example, we're going to show you the Louisville prospectus, at least a few pages of it. And recently, Tim and I worked together with a team of professionals on the proposal we put together for the Amazon headquarter site selection activity. So the nice thing is we have some experience to draw from. We have some existing data that we can begin with, but we do need to prepare a specific prospectus, a very simple to read and understand document that includes the data that Tim mentioned, but then also starts to get into more of the assets that can be leveraged here with investments in our opportunity zones. In addition, having shovel-ready projects is key. So we've heard that prospectuses that include some opportunities for investment, indicating the vision of the community that has been done through planning activities like area-specific plans, business area-specific plans, et cetera. These are of interest to investors because then they don't have to develop the vision or the project themselves. So here in Louisville, you can see their waterfront project, which we could too represent in a prospectus. In addition, focus on neighborhood business opportunities, small business development, opportunities for added infill, filling vacancies within business districts. So alignment with those existing planning efforts is key.
So where's the right place in all this? A lot of it's going to be building awareness and in marketing the Grand Rapids prospectus as well as the others in the region that are working on them that have opportunity zones. Part of the thing that that'll be part of this is actually leveraging our local network. Again, this is not something that we are seeing that we would be traveling across the United States to market and represent opportunity zones. There will be a time and a place for that. But really, we're finding ample opportunity here, as I said, with our local law firms, our local financial institutions that have national branches. There are lots and lots of opportunities here. I've spoken with one legal advisor that I work with on opportunity zones that helps me interpret some of this legalese information. And her comment to me when we met in December was, if you have anything in the region, let me know. I'm tired of traveling. Her clients at this point are sending her around the country looking for investments because there are timelines that need to be met for this. I don't want to get into that here, but there are timelines that need to be met for this. And she said, I'd rather see these investments going here than Phoenix. So marketing and awareness is going to be a crucial part of this. The final piece of this, guidance for communities. Again, this is a proactive thing. This is not a brownfield type program where you simply just put the authority in place and you wait for applications to come in. This is something where we need to take a proactive approach and start marketing this prospectus if we want investment in these communities. Urgency is key. Again, unlike other programs, this one has a sunset, December 31st, 2026. This program goes away. So there are other timelines in this that are actually at the end of this year. There will be certain discounts that will go away or certain benefits that will go away to investors. So there is a particular amplitude to get this done this year, to get projects done this year, but it will end in 2026. Again, I want to reiterate, think like an investor on this, on this project, and then it'll allow you, it also allows you to layer additional programs and incentives when you can locally. So.
All right, so in terms of next steps, we'd like to make the same presentation to other partner organizations such as the Economic Development Corporation, the Downtown Development Authority, the Southtown and South Division Granville Corridor Improvement District authorities, and continue to work with the right place on developing a City of Grand Rapids prospectus. In doing so, we would like to also engage community with 2 community workshops in the months of May and June, and bring updates back to the Economic Development Project team on our progress, and report back to the City Commission in July. We would then work to familiarize opportunity funds with the Grand Rapids prospectus and prepare policy recommendations to support development of additional incentives within these opportunity zones. We'd be glad to answer any questions that you might have, or we can keep moving.
All right, I'll start with Commissioner O'Connor.
Well, thank you for this very informative update. I'm just wondering, you said 201 Market's in this
It is.
And the fact that Tim mentioned that stadiums are available as expenses and that, I just wondering if, since we haven't had an update on 201 Market in about a year now, if we gave them an extension, just wondering if it's time to revisit that stadium conversation, not 201 Market.
It may be a little premature, but I know we'll get an update soon.
Mayor, we're actually preparing to bring an update, if not at the next meeting, the meeting after.
Great, thank you. All right, Commissioner?
Thank you so much for this presentation. I think it answers a lot of questions, but it opens up a whole bunch more. And I see a lot of members from the corridor improvement districts out in the audience. Thank you so much, City Manager, for inviting them and making sure that they were aware that this would be presented. And even the timeline that you have with trying to share this information with the community to develop a plan. I am curious if, so earlier during this meeting, we talked about the river restoration, and I'm just curious, we already kind of know that there are partners, private partners who are already interested in funding or participating in that. Would they then be, would they then qualify then for this? And and can you already have kind of a commitment for an investment that then can be, that would qualify?
So I think there is a way to structure what you're describing, and that is working with the river restoration team to understand where their capital's coming from and whether or not a fund could be supportive of that investment within the zone. So I think that you're onto something, and we will work with partners to identify those opportunities.
Okay. And then if commitments have already been made, can those then qualify?
They can, they're gonna need some legal advice on that. The one thing I will say, we didn't get a chance to touch on this too much, is that most, if not all, of the opportunity funds that we are seeing being built right now are built by investors. What do investors expect? A return.
Yeah.
And so there are several funds that have been created as more philanthropic funds that are looking to do things in the community. But I don't want to mislead anybody. Most of these funds are for investors expecting a return, so.
So then my assumption, I was going to ask this a little bit later, but my assumption then is that this really is for well-to-do people. Is that fair to say?
This program is going to benefit those that have capital gains. And yes, those are well-to-do people.
Well, let me balance that. In terms of, there is an investor benefit, but what cities are doing across the country is to try to leverage that as a community benefit. So to find ways where both the investor and the community can benefit from new investments into the economy.
And that is, again, the importance of the vision. So if the community has a plan that represents their vision and investment opportunities are identified within those plans, then investors can help make those community visions possible.
And then, I'm sorry, I'm not trying to hog, but this has been kind of something that we've been asking questions about for some time. So then, these existing plans, and I think you may have spoken to this earlier, Ms. Wood, that the existing ASPs and BASPs will inform whatever it is that we're trying to create. So the work that has gone into the creation of all of those is not in vain. It will be something that's utilized to create this bigger, broader plan.
Exactly. That'll help build the prospectus foundation.
Okay, thank you.
Great, thank you. Well, I appreciate this presentation. I know many of us have had questions. I've had the opportunity to see several prospectus that other cities have done, and I feel like we're a little bit behind the 8 ball because some of them are exceptionally well done. And I know that if we do want to try to figure out a way to incent investment in priorities that we have, we really need to be strategic. Other cities are doing that. And so I'm glad to see this move forward, and I'm glad to see the timeline that we'll be doing some community engagement, getting feedback as we work to create our own. And so if you could keep us updated on that, make sure that we know when those are so that we can attend if we're available, that would be great. So thank you. Commissioners, I am looking at the time, and we've been sitting here for 2 hours now, and I know some of us need a quick break. We do have a number of action items still before us. So I'm going to propose a quick 2-minute bathroom break for those of us who need it. And then we'll come back and we'll start hopefully getting through our action items relatively quickly, considering many of them are ones that we've talked about and are familiar with already. So if we can take a quick 2-minute recess, I'm not going to adjourn, I'm just going to recess momentarily, fill up your coffee, use the restroom, and then come right back in here, please. We are going to get restarted, so I'm going to ask my city manager here to come, and who are we missing? Commissioner O'Connor, I'm going to go ahead and get started because we do have a quorum, and he's right outside that door. All right, so next on the agenda, can I get a motion for a resolution accepting the Hartside Quality of Life Study final report?
So moved.
Support.
All right, and we have Ms. Lipscomb here. Did I say your last name right?
Yes.
Thank you. I want to make sure. So you've worked long and hard on this. I think all of us have had a chance to review it. Anything to add as we look for a formal resolution today?
Sure, just a couple of things. Again, Letitia Lipscomb, Community Engagement Project Manager. I have the added bonus of being housed in the Planning Department because as we know, how we develop and design our cities bears great weight on how people live, work, and play and learn in communities. And so I had the privilege of speaking to you all before on March 5th of 2019, and I am back in support of the resolution asking the City Commission to formally accept the Heartside Quality of Life Study. Just as a little bit of brief background, this process has been 40 years in the making, but in July of 2016, the Commission received a letter that dealt with cited concerns from citizens about lighting, parking, wayfinding, and safety within the Heartside area. And so as a result, we embarked upon an incredible journey in September of 2017 to engage the community about being the change they wish to see in their own community. We had the opportunity to partner with the Planning Department, DGRI, along with receiving support from the emerging Heartside Neighborhood Association. And so you all received a copy of a final report where we listed some final recommendations that were all created for neighbors by neighbors. Some of those recommendations, just for the general public's knowledge, included a couple of things like providing continued neighborhood and quality of life study implementation support, which is very important. Participation to date has been unprecedented from neighbors in the community, and so we want to make sure we're maintaining that momentum. We want to complete a pilot restroom to address the immediate restroom needs and develop long-term solutions that are sustainable in our neighborhood. We are in the process of starting lighting improvements, and so we will need continued funding for that. In addition to that, we're considering a mixed use and housing market study, as well as providing a mental health first aid training in the neighborhood. And then finally, we're working on implementing a substance abuse peer support pilot program. So given some of the amazing work that the neighbors have embarked upon, that I've had the honor and privilege of being able to facilitate over the last year and a half, we really recommend and hope that you will adopt and formally accept the Heartside Quality of Life Study. Are there any questions, comments, or concerns?
Commissioners, any questions or comments?
Just a bravo, because of the level of engagement. It was incredible. Great report. Thank you. Thanks for your work on it, Letitia.
Thank you.
Commissioner?
No, I just thank you for the work. It's been, having an opportunity to read through it and see not only some of the, the concerns of the community that we've already been working on, but this continued partnership that we're going to have between Heartside and the city to continue to try to address some of these problems. It's exciting.
Thank you, sir.
Any other questions or comments? All right. With that, I'll call the question. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? It carries.
Thank
you so much. All right, next that will take us to a resolution considering zoning ordinance text amendments regarding food trucks and setting a date for the adoption of those amendments. Can I get a motion?
Support.
All right. Suzanne is not here, so Kristen will tell us about this.
Yeah, so I'm not sure how I got the misfortune of following up with a zoning text amendment after Letitia's great project, but here we are. But it is about food trucks. So in the interest and respect of your time, I'm going to go through this very quickly and certainly be available for questions. But there was significant background on this. Andy Guy did quite a bit of work and presented to you earlier this year with the pilot ordinance. And there's quite a bit of information in my staff report as well. So there's some history, some good history there. We also do have a current ordinance regulating food trucks. Based on the number of words that you can see on this slide, you can probably safely assume that the accusations are that it's extremely burdensome and very frustrating. And I can also tell you, based on my experience, that it is simply not regulating. The regulatory structure is not how food truck operators would like to operate within the city of Grand Rapids. So we researched, we engaged. Highlights from the engagement process and the surveys are that really there's no two business districts that want us to regulate food trucks the same. And so that told us that they would like to see a tailored approach. So where we are today is we've looked at the zone districts, we've heard, we've listened, we've researched, and effectively what we did was break down the community by zone districts. So in the office zone district and industrial zone district, it's a fairly flexible regulatory process. And so from a review standpoint, if it's an ancillary use or there's an office building or an industrial complex, the food truck operator can operate adjacent or on that same property with an administrative review process. If it's in a commercial zone district, then that's where the Taylor approach becomes a little bit more unique. So if it's less than 90 days, if the food truck wants to be less than 90 days and it's an ancillary use, so think of the bank property and the food truck operating in the parking lot, then if it's less than 90 days, we can do it at a staff level or temporary use permit. If it's more than 90 days, then we kick it into what we call that qualified review process. Or if it's a vacant property and the food truck would like to operate there indefinitely, for example, or a food truck pod would like to be there, then it's that qualified review. Recall the conversation we had with accessory dwelling units recently. If you need clarification on that qualified review, please let me know. But effectively, we will hold a public hearing and a planning commission review if there is interest from the immediate neighborhood within 300 feet. And if there is no interest or concern, then we proceed at a staff level. And so we think that this process really gives us some flexibility. It's responsive to how food truck operators have indicated they would like to operate. There are still a litany of regulations that must be adhered to. So we look at generators, noise, lighting, parking, trash, all of those things that we know people would like us to still consider. It's not unregulated. We really focused on the process. And then on the right-hand side, you can see how that qualified review, if you will, would work. So that was a really brief summary with the highlights, but please let me know if you have any questions.
All right. And this is to set a public hearing for, is it April 23rd?
We were not anticipating a public hearing. I believe it was just scheduled for ordinance
I'm sorry,
consideration.
scheduling the text amendments. So it'll come back before us on the 23rd, is that right?
23rd, yes.
Okay, all right. Thank you for clarifying that. Commissioners, any questions or comments? Commissioner?
One quick one. So I would assume with a qualified review in the mixed-use commercial zone districts, that if the SIDS kind of predetermined where they had had that conversation with their, perhaps even with their neighborhood associations and business associations, that we probably wouldn't even need that.
I think if there's an engagement process that goes along with that determination, I agree.
I would think that that would be something to bring up. I don't know if Jessica Solis is here, but I know she's having a meeting with the SIDS coming up, I think this week or next, just to get them thinking about that so that they can save those food trucks some time.
Yeah. That's a good point. And we had talked about that when we first created this ordinance. Commissioners, other questions or comments? All right, then I'll call the question. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? It carries. All right, so we'll see it back before us in just a couple weeks. Next, that will take us to a resolution approving a travel request for our city comptroller to attend a public finance conference in April. Can I get a motion?
So moved.
Support.
All right, any questions? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? It carries. All right, next that will take us to a resolution approving an amendment to the City Commission policy number 100-02. This is the use of public funds for elected officials for travel and other expenses. Can I get a motion?
Support.
All right, and we have our comptroller to tell us about this. She worked with our city attorney's office in making these changes.
Yes, good morning, Mayor and Commissioners. This is just a quick update to your City Commission policy number 100-02 for use of public funds by elected officials for travel and other expenses, and that includes me, so so this applies to all of us who are elected. There is a separate policy for administrative purposes that is set by the city manager. So briefly, the three changes are just to clarify some terms and phrases. We added definitions, and we added the words "on an exception basis," if requested within a reasonable period of time, for the use of advances. That's become a very manual process, so until we get a better system. we would try to limit those requests. And then we've updated the per diem allowance to meet current IRS regulations and match what we're doing at the administrative level. And then towards the end, you, Mayor, as the spokesperson for the city, are authorized to take dignitaries and others out. So for local business expenses, otherwise known as meals, we replaced, instead of the number of guests, we replaced that word with names. We thought that would be more transparent. And that was my experience in the private sector. When to justify the business expense, we had to provide names of who we were taking out. So those are I think the three main differences. There were some other grammatical and spelling changes that were made. And we are recommending approval. Any questions?
Thank you. Well, thank you for your work on this. I think the clarification is good. Appreciate that. Commissioners, any questions for our comptroller?
I just have a comment that you're going to keep us on schedule with our meals.
Oh, yes. So
I found that kind of humorous.
There's a couple of different sets of rules that apply.
Okay.
And maybe a third for those of us who are elected. So to comply with state law, I thought I would start by going to their policy. So I just copied and pasted some of the provisions from their policy. That way, I figure if we're doing what they're doing, hopefully, then we're in line with state law as well. And I would also like to thank my staff that worked on this. Our accounts payable supervisor, Cheryl Keller, spent a lot of time and will be coming out with guidelines for us.
Great, thank you. Other questions, comments, Commissioner?
Just a quick one. Thanks so much for the presentation. I'm curious to know if the monthly report, I'm forgetting exactly what it's called, but there was a monthly report.
Monthly travel report.
Travel report,
Yeah.
excuse me, if that could be sent to us kind of individually. I know it's embedded in the hundreds of pages in the fiscal committee.
It's part of the fiscal agenda.
Yeah, so I was just wondering if that's something that could be extracted out.
I'll make a note to try to send that out separately as well. I'll have to, we've changed how we've done the routing process for the agenda items, so I'll try to make a mental note to have.
If it's feasible.
The admin secretary, yeah. I approve it in minute tracks, so extrapolating it out, I'll have to think about how we might be able to do that.
Okay, thanks.
All right, good question. All right, any other questions or comments, Commissioner, or City Manager?
Mayor, real briefly, thank you, Comptroller, for your work, and you and City Attorney. We will also be revising our administrative policy for travel here shortly. I just wanted to highlight one issue that relates to commission. This is not out-of-town travel, but this is local business expense, and I briefly mentioned it during the development of this process, that I've had conversation with a couple of commissioners that ask about local, some kind of allotment or reimbursement for local business expenses. And I know that's not in this report, but I would just highlight that as something that the commission and the comptroller may want to consider in the future.
Good point, thank you. All right, with that, I'll call the question. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? It carries. All right, thank you to our comptroller and the team who worked on this. Appreciate it. All right, next that will take us to a resolution establishing an obsolete property rehabilitation district pursuant to PA 146 of 2000 for 739 4th Street LLC located at 739 4th Street Northwest. Can I get a motion?
Support.
All right, welcome.
Thank you. Good morning, Mayor. Good morning, Commissioners. There are actually 3 items on your agenda this morning for this project. Redevelopment project proposed at 739 4th Street Northwest. This project proposes to redevelop a 6,700 square foot building into 7 residential apartments and first floor office space, as well as construction right to the north of that building. for an additional 6 new residential apartment units. Total investment in the project is approximately $2.3 million with the creation of 5 new permanent full-time jobs at approximately, with wages at approximately $22 per hour. So the first request on your agenda this morning is for the establishment of an obsolete property rehabilitation exemption district, followed by a 10-year Oprah certificate. That's the next item.
All right, thank you. Thank you. Commissioners, any questions or comments on this project? I know we heard about it at a public hearing and received comment. I'll turn to my first ward commissioners. Anything to add?
I'm glad to see this vacant building come back alive. The scale of it's right. The neighborhood association supports it. It's a great project.
Correct.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, and again, these are difficult projects as they're the, kind of medium-sized infill projects that are difficult to pull off and make the economics work. So I'm glad someone's willing to take on that risk.
All right. I'll call the question. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? It carries. All right, next that will take us to the resolution approving the 10-year Oprah for the same project. Can I get a motion?
So moved.
Support. All right, commissioners, anything to add to this or questions? All right, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? It carries. And then last, a resolution approving a brownfield plan amendment for the same project at 739 4th Street. Can I get a motion?
So moved.
Support.
All right, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? It carries. All right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. All right, next that will take us to a resolution approving an amendment to the North Corridor Improvement Authority Development Plan and Tax Increment Financing Plan.
So
Can I get a
moved.
motion?
Support.
All right, Mr. Klooster, you want to tell us about this?
Sure. Good morning, Mayor. Good afternoon, Mayor and Commissioners. This is final approval of an amendment to the North Corridor Improvement Authority's Tax Increment Finance and Development Plan. So that was recommended to you by the North Corridor at their January meeting, and you did have a public hearing on this in March. And so this would be final approval for that plan, which would allow the North Corridor to begin capturing taxes next fiscal year, this upcoming fiscal year.
All right, thank you. I'll turn to our colleague over here who has spent many years on the North Corridor SID. Commissioner Kelly, you want to add anything to this or have any questions?
No, I don't have any questions. I'm just excited that we've been able to do the reset and that hopefully in the future, near future, hopefully we'll be able to capture some money for that district.
It's looking good for next year, yes.
Knock on wood. All right, any other questions or comments? All right, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? It carries. All right, Commissioners, for this next one, I think I'll actually turn to our city manager, largely because it's a technicality. And so back before us is a resolution setting a public hearing for our next meeting, April 23rd, to consider the adoption of the human rights ordinance that we were briefed on at our last meeting. So can I get a motion?
So moved.
Support.
All right, City Manager, you want to tell us why this is back before us?
Sure. At your last meeting, we initially, you voted to approve the public hearing for tonight. During that course of scheduling the public hearing, there was a glitch in the publication, and so we were asking to reschedule it and do the proper notification for April 23rd at your next meeting. People may show up tonight for the public hearing, and we suggest allowing them to continue to make comments, and we'll just make sure that that will be reflected on the record on the 23rd.
All right, Commissioners, any questions about that? All right, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? It carries. All right, Commissioners, so as we get ready to adjourn, just one reminder, in 17 minutes, we have Economic Development Project Team. So the members of that will meet downstairs in 601. My understanding is that there is lunch available downstairs on the 6th floor, so if you are hungry, please grab a bite. Those of you on Economic Development Project Team, you're welcome to bring it to the meeting if you like. And then we are back here tonight for our 7 o'clock meeting. We have a full agenda tonight as well, so be prepared for likely another long night. So Commissioners, anything else before I adjourn? All right, with that, we are adjourned.